Chapter 501, The Possibility of Independence. Before being expelled from the school board, the Malfoy family was the most influential family within the board. They owned numerous properties and were the largest taxpayers to the Ministry of Magic in the British wizarding world. The most troubling aspect was that Lucius Malfoy remained a loyal Death Eater. Several seats on the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry board were in similar situations, which left Atticus Blaine feeling trapped. Once the war begins, Hogwarts serves as a spiritual beacon, and whether this beacon can be raised depends on the will of the opposition. Atticus trusted Dumbledore's judgment and aimed to restore the glory of the pureblood families. However, he feared that Voldemort, who wielded the banner, lacked such vision. This was a life-and-death struggle, and the hidden dangers needed to be addressed. "What is your solution, Atticus?" Dumbledore asked, understanding that Atticus had come to seek his support with a plan already in mind. When it came to accumulating wealth, Dumbledore knew he couldn't match Atticus. "Before we abandon the school board, Hogwarts must establish its own industry," Atticus replied calmly. "Before returning to Hogwarts, I spoke with Remus. I asked him to investigate all the essential materials for everyday life in the wizarding world, as well as the workshops and actual controllers behind their production." "I see your point, Atticus, but you're hoping to challenge established products with something entirely new. Perhaps you're planning to leverage your reputation, but that might still be difficult," Dumbledore said, frowning. Even the bright candlelight couldn't dispel the gloom on Atticus's face. He hesitated to reveal his entire plan, knowing that without Dumbledore's support, it would be doomed to fail. However, he soon decided to trust Dumbledore, as mutual trust was essential in facing the crisis together. "This is a complex plan," Atticus began, his tone calm but his eyes cold, causing Dumbledore to frown. "Our primary goal is to free Hogwarts from external constraints. To achieve this, Hogwarts must have its own industry. I asked Remus to investigate the producers of materials vital to ordinary wizards' lives. I don't know who they are, but I predict the investigation will implicate some families on the school board. I don't want to destroy these families, but there's an unbreakable condition. They cannot side with Voldemort. If anyone violates this, their family and industry must go bankrupt, and Hogwarts will immediately take over the market to establish its own capital chain." "Capital chain," Dumbledore repeated, his voice heavy. "How do you plan to ensure that, Atticus?" "I doubt others will stand by, as Hogwarts claims this revenue." "We need the Ministry of Magic's support," Atticus replied, his demeanor steady. "We don't have the authority to publicly declare a family's involvement in Voldemort's activities. Only the Ministry can do that, seize their properties, bankrupt them, and protect Hogwarts' interests." Watts's agent entered the room. "Incidentally, I believe Remus is quite suited to the role of an agent. After enduring years of hardship, it's time for him to savor the life of a wealthy man." "Remus will be pleased with the arrangements you've made for him," Dumbledore replied calmly, unfazed by Atticus Blaine's private plans for Remus. They were in the midst of discussing strategies to win a war that involved the lives of everyone and the future of wizarding Britain, all for the greater good. "But expecting your assistance to the Ministry of Magic regarding Greyback and the Quidditch final night to sway Connolly is unrealistic," Dumbledore astutely pointed out, highlighting the flaws in Atticus's plan. "I understand, and I'm prepared," Atticus responded simply. Dumbledore's blue eyes focused on Atticus's composed face, his brows furrowing. He understood what Atticus was preparing for and knew that Atticus was resolute in his decision. Seeing Dumbledore's tacit approval, Atticus exhaled a sigh of relief and continued, "The cooperation of the Ministry of Magic is crucial, Headmaster Dumbledore. You must know that when Voldemort first rallied his supporters, he did so under the guise of restoring the glory of the pureblood families. Only after gaining power did his true nature emerge. This is another way to target Voldemort. Anyone daring to support him will have all their family's properties seized. They must choose between their delusional dreams and their families. I wonder if any of Voldemort's Death Eaters are truly steadfast supporters. This approach is a double-edged sword. It will undoubtedly impact the work and lives of ordinary people in the wizarding world. While Hogwarts can take over some responsibilities, it cannot manage everything. Some individuals will inevitably lose the jobs they rely on for survival. Therefore, unless absolutely necessary, Atticus won't recklessly expand his reach. "What a brilliant plan, young one," a smooth voice suddenly echoed in the otherwise quiet office. Sirius's great-great-grandfather, Phineas Black, stroked his goatee and remarked appreciatively, "But I'm afraid there's a problem you haven't considered." Atticus turned and bowed politely to Phineas's portrait, as if ready to heed his advice. According to the ancient contract signed between Hogwarts and the families on the school board, Hogwarts is not permitted to generate profit for itself. Furthermore, any unilateral decision by Hogwarts to dissolve the school board is ineffective unless Hogwarts can repay all the financial support received since the contract's inception, spanning hundreds of years. This is an unimaginably massive debt. Atticus's brow furrowed as he looked at the old figure across the desk, while Dumbledore nodded in agreement. "Consider this. The pure-blood wizard families are no fools. They would have ensured some means to restrain Hogwarts." A rhythmic tapping sound filled the office as Atticus drummed his fingers on the armrest. He leaned back in his chair, gazing at the artistic paintings on the office's dome, and exhaled slowly. If such a contract existed, Hogwarts' unilateral decision to abolish the school board would be invalid, meaning the actions and statements of the Hogwarts headmaster would be restricted, with no means to repay the debt. The financial support Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry has received over the past century is substantial. After a moment, Atticus relaxed his brow. "I believe the pureblood families who signed this contract must have considered a scenario where they wish to sever ties with Hogwarts. They can cease allocating education funds at any time, effectively severing their relationship with Hogwarts." Phineas Black said cheerfully, "Oh, thank you, Principal Black." Atticus Blaine also smiled warmly. He gazed into Dumbledore's blue eyes and said with a lively tone, "It's a matter of who casts the first spell. Which of the two wizards facing each other will act first? If Voldemort doesn't consider using the school board to cut off funding to pressure you, Principal Dumbledore will make sure someone gives him a nudge." End of this chapter. Chapter 502. A More Secure Plan. Atticus Blaine devised a plan to remind Voldemort of the potential leverage he could exert through the school board, thereby creating pressure on himself. This would provide an opportunity for Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry to sever its ties with the board. In a bold move, Atticus intended to use official power and public opinion to launch a thorough investigation into the estates of pure-blood wizard families allied with Voldemort, sowing discord among the Death Eaters. Dumbledore's silver brows arched higher as he considered Atticus's strategy. He realized there was still room for improvement in his own understanding of conspiracies. "It's truly unfortunate for Tom to have crossed paths with you, Atticus," Dumbledore mused, quickly processing the plan in his mind. Once Tom regains his magic, he'll be eager to reunite with his former followers and recruit dark creatures to expand his power. If we introduce this plan at the right moment, it will cause him significant trouble. "But Atticus," Dumbledore's tone shifted to one of seriousness, "you must understand that if we proceed, it will impact many innocent lives and disrupt the current structure of the magical world." Atticus's eyelids fluttered slightly, taken aback by Dumbledore's perceptiveness. Indeed, this plan was not only a strategy against Voldemort, but also an opportunity to reform the stagnant social order and production structure of the magical world. "Change is necessary," Atticus replied succinctly, not elaborating further. The cold rain and mist brushed against his face, clearing his slightly foggy mind. The world outside the castle remained dark, with occasional flashes of distant thunder, though the sound was faint compared to the noise of elves secretly cleaning the castle. That night, Atticus and Dumbledore had a candid discussion. Dumbledore did not oppose the measures to free Hogwarts from the school board's control, but he was clearly reluctant for Atticus to become too entangled with the Ministry of Magic or to use the impending war to destabilize the existing order of the magical world. In other words, he was hesitant for Atticus to launch a large-scale attack on the pure-blood wizard families. This was understandable. Dumbledore was not blind to the dangers posed by the pure-blood family's monopoly over the magical world. His approach was to remain at Hogwarts, continuously integrating Muggle-born wizards into the magical community to effect change. While this method was effective to a degree, it would eventually reach a plateau, as the best resources in the magical world remained in the hands of pure-blood families. Dumbledore likely recognized this, but lacked the resolve to initiate sweeping changes, fearing it would lead to another bloody conflict. However, Atticus believed that such a war was inevitable, and it would be more efficient to merge the two battlefields and resolve the issues simultaneously. In the distance, a brilliant flash of lightning briefly illuminated the night before vanishing. This summer was bidding farewell in a dramatic and somber manner. Atticus gazed at the fading thunder for a long time. As he turned back, the steady light from Dumbledore's office window shone like an eternal flame. "Sleep," Atticus murmured, curling up as he prepared to rest. Atticus Blaine rarely displayed any signs of youthful exuberance, but as he walked slowly across the corridor bridge in the rain towards his dormitory, there was a hint of it. The thunderstorm had ended with a spectacular display, the explosive roar and the airwaves pushing against the yard wall. Despite the thunder's cover, the noise woke the nearby neighbors. Lights flickered on in the second-floor bedrooms of several houses, but the heavy rain obscured their view, preventing them from seeing clearly what was happening at the eccentric old man's home. Yet, the eerie silver light that occasionally flashed through the rain sent shivers down the spines of the Muggles, filling them with dread. In a panic, the Muggles reached or the landlines on their bedside tables and dialed the police. Oh God! When 4 police officers dashed out of their patrol car into the rain, kicked open the rickety subway door, and stormed into the courtyard with guns drawn, they were taken aback by what they saw in the flashlight's beam. They all gasped in unison. "You planted explosives in the garden, didn't you?" "Sir, answer my question," demanded a portly policeman, pointing his gun at an old man with crooked legs who was sitting on the floor of the entrance hall, leaning against the wall and panting heavily. "Get away, you foolish Muggles!" the disheveled old man shouted, waving his cane in the air as if he could ward off the intruding police. "Look at this! Oh my God, I must be dreaming!" exclaimed another officer, grabbing the sleeve of the one questioning the old man and forcing him to look towards the yard. The officers stood frozen, as if under a petrification spell, while the rain continued to drench them. "Damn!" The old man's cheek twitched with irritation as he looked at the trash can, its lid blown off, spewing garbage in all directions like a machine gun. "The Ministry of Magic will have something to say about this." The heavy rain blurred the line between night and day. It wasn't until noon the next day that the wizards who had been coming and going from the courtyard finally disappeared. Arthur, who had repaired the overturned lawn and collapsed courtyard wall, stood in front of the iron gate with 2 huge dark circles under his eyes, weakly waving to Mad-Eye Moody. "Thank you, Arthur," Moody called gruffly from the hall. "I'll keep a closer eye on your little ones." Mr. Weasley said nothing, offering only a weary smile before disapparating from Moody's territory. Moody, standing in the foyer, did not immediately close the door. He stared in the direction Mr. Weasley had left, his electric blue magical eye whirling in its socket. Clang! The door slammed shut with a violent force, plunging the room into darkness. Moody limped back to his kitchen, standing before the extinguished fireplace. He took out his wand, fiddling with it for a moment before twisting his wrist and pointing the tip at the fireplace. A hot flame ignited the wood stacked inside. He then grabbed a handful of flue powder from the mantel and tossed it in, waving his wand. "The trouble has been taken care of." Whoosh! The shadow of a giant python's head appeared in the swirling flames. A high-pitched, cold voice emanated from the fireplace. "Do you still harbor any doubts or fears about the plan that is about to be executed? I just want to confirm with you that you still intend to proceed with this plan, correct?" Moody's face was grim, and there was a clear resistance in his normal eye. "Even if you have seen it, Atticus Blaine is not the ordinary person you think. Under the watchful eyes of Dumbledore and Blaine, extracting Harry Potter from Hogwarts is no easy feat. Atticus Blaine did surprise me, I must admit. Killing him is not something I can accomplish without regaining my physical form, yet I've explained repeatedly that my plan is flawless. Neither Dumbledore nor Atticus Blaine will see through it. The voice emanating from the flames was tinged with impatience. After your foolish actions at the World Cup, it was expected that Dumbledore and Blaine would be more vigilant. However, I've adjusted the plan to make it even more foolproof. You must understand that you need to prove your worth to me before you can receive my assistance. Consider yourself fortunate. Voldemort rarely grants opportunities. If it weren't for the fact that my loyal servant was gravely injured and requires time to recover, I would not have forgiven your unauthorized actions at the World Cup. End of this chapter. Chapter 503, A New School Year. Today's weather is the worst it has been in recent days, yet the air on the Hogwarts campus is filled with a sense of anticipation. Every staff member, busy with preparations for the new school year, feels that Hogwarts truly comes alive only when the cold castle is bustling with young wizards. Harry stepped off the train at Hogsmeade Station and immediately spotted the brightly lit Hogwarts castle through the gloomy rain. His initial excitement was dampened by the absence of Sirius at King's Cross Station and the melancholy brought on by his encounter with Draco Malfoy on the train. Ron, too, was in low spirits due to his peculiar attire, but both of them, along with their classmates, eagerly boarded the horseless carriages waiting outside the station. After a long summer, everyone was keen to share their holiday experiences, with most conversations revolving around the duel that captivated the world during the Quidditch World Cup final. My grandma didn't want to go, Neville lamented, watching the animated discussions around him. She refused to buy a ticket, thinking the game would be dull. But after reading about that night in the newspaper, she regretted it. Look at it this way, Neville, Hermione consoled him. Many wizards witnessed that duel, but not many have the chance to be personally tutored by Professor Blaine. Plus, you're his appointed teaching assistant. At the mention of Professor Blaine, Hermione suddenly shivered with concern. When school starts, if Professor Blaine finds we haven't made enough progress, will he be furious with us? Oh, where's Luna? I need to find her. Speaking of which, Harry interjected, his worry evident, at least you kept up with your running over the summer, Hermione. I'm afraid my skills have deteriorated. Enough, you two, Ron snapped. When you were dodging that witch Melanoff, you were as nimble as the gnomes in my garden. The carriage passed through a gate flanked by winged boar sculptures and rumbled down the wide driveway, swaying violently in the strong wind. Harry leaned against the window, watching Hogwarts draw nearer, its many lit windows glowing dimly through the thick rain. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning split the sky, and Harry jumped up, pointing outside. Someone just flew over. Harry's exclamation silenced the carriage for a moment. Then, everyone except Hermione rushed to his window, eyes wide with curiosity. Unfortunately, the lightning had faded, leaving nothing visible. You mean, Hermione said skeptically, someone's practicing Quidditch in this weather? Impossible, Harry replied, still excited. Even Wood wouldn't do something so reckless. I saw someone flying without a broomstick. Could it be Professor Blaine? Hermione asked, astonished. Among all the Hogwarts professors, only Professor Blaine had demonstrated the ability to fly without a broom. She peered out the window in the direction Harry indicated. That direction? Is it the Black Lake? Why would Professor Blaine be heading to the Black Lake? Neville wondered aloud. Maybe someone fell in, Ron speculated. I hope it's not Hagrid. If Hagrid's in the lake, the first-year students might have to take a cold dip. In this weather, Ron shivered at the thought. Atticus Blaine gazed with interest at the darkness outside the carriage. From the marble stairs to the foyer, the students' clothes were drenched in the rain. Everyone hurried to squeeze into the auditorium, eager to warm themselves, but the wet ground was slippery. The crowd of students trying to push their way in only made the situation worse. Ouch! In the chaos, Hermione was painfully stepped on and let out a cry, but Harry and Ron, who were nearby, didn't hear her. They were too focused on keeping their balance, so Hermione had to shrink like a quail, inching forward, bit by bit, enduring the pain. With a strong gust of wind, Atticus Blaine descended from the sky to the ground. Observing the blocked path and the little wizards with pained expressions in the rain, he sighed. From his sleeve, he drew his wand and pointed it skyward. A stream of milky white light emerged from the tip, twisting and transforming in mid-air to form a canopy that shielded them from the rain. Then, he directed the wand at the shivering, soaked students, releasing a warm breeze. The young wizards were astonished to find that not only had the rain above them ceased, but their drenched clothes were now dry. Professor McGonagall quickly approached from the auditorium. Under the guidance of the two professors, the traffic soon flowed smoothly again. "How about it, Atticus?" Professor McGonagall called out eagerly, standing on tiptoes as the crowd began to move slowly. "Has the child been found?" "Dennis!" Colin emerged from the throng of students. Seeing the little boy held by Professor Blaine, he shouted with surprise and excitement. "What's going on? Why are you with Professor Blaine?" "I fell into the lake, Colin," Dennis exclaimed, his hands and feet flailing. "Then this gentleman flew over and pulled me out. Wait, you are Professor Blaine!" "Just wait in line, little guy," Atticus said with a smile, setting the first-year student on the ground. He then floated into the auditorium above the heads of the young wizards, admired by all. The auditorium had regained its former splendor, specially decorated for the new semester's banquet. Hundreds of candles hovered above the tables, casting a glow on the golden plates and goblets. By the time Harry and the others squeezed in, the 4 house tables were already filled with chattering students. A 5th table stood at the top of the auditorium. Besides Professor McGonagall, who was still waiting for the first-year students in the foyer, the familiar faculty members were already seated. "There's one empty seat," Harry pointed out to Hermione, indicating the vacant spot at the staff table. "Probably for the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor." "But where is he?" Hermione asked anxiously, craning her neck to scan the auditorium. "I don't see a new professor. Could it be that Professor Dumbledore hasn't found anyone?" Hermione's speculation seemed plausible. Even after the sorting ceremony concluded and the 4 long tables were laden with delicious food, no one occupied the vacant seat at the staff table. Watching the young wizards devour their meals below, Dumbledore smiled. He set down his knife and fork, turned slightly, and looked at Atticus. "I will announce to the children later that this year's Triwizard Tournament will be held again at Hogwarts. Atticus, you have made a great contribution to this." "I believe it should be you who delivers this joyful news to the children," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying a gentle authority. At the faculty table, some professors were absorbed in their meals, while others engaged in light conversation with their colleagues. However, Dumbledore's unexpected suggestion caught everyone's attention, leaving them visibly surprised. Traditionally, the headmaster's speech at the opening dinner was a cherished custom at Hogwarts. Since Dumbledore had assumed the role of headmaster, he had never missed this important occasion, regardless of his busy schedule. Yet today, he had asked Atticus Blaine to speak in his stead. It was as if he were entrusting a young wizard with a significant responsibility, sending a clear and unmistakable signal. End of this chapter. Chapter 504. Change of Times. Among the deans of the 4 houses at Hogwarts, Professor Flitwick and Professor Sprout appeared somewhat surprised. They were well aware that Hogwarts had managed to outshine its competitors and secure the opportunity to host the Triwizard Tournament, largely thanks to Atticus Blaine's efforts. However, they were uncertain if Dumbledore had chosen Atticus to deliver the speech for these reasons. Professor McGonagall looked at Atticus with eyes full of encouragement. The Dean of Slytherin House maintained a neutral expression, though his dark eyes frequently darted between Atticus and Dumbledore. Atticus casually picked up a napkin and wiped the cream from the corner of his mouth. He nodded nonchalantly, seemingly oblivious to any underlying signals. "No problem, Headmaster Dumbledore." The 4 long tables in the Great Hall buzzed with noise. Over at Gryffindor House, Dennis, a young wizard who had just joined that year, animatedly recounted how he had fallen into the water and how Hagrid had sent out a rescue signal, with Professor Blaine flying over to fish him out. Neville listened eagerly, his ears perking up whenever the Quidditch World Cup final or the duel that night was mentioned. Hermione, meanwhile, had knocked over her goblet of orange juice in shock after learning from nearly headless Nick that the Hogwarts kitchen housed the most house elves in the UK. On the Slytherin side, Draco was proudly rolling up his sleeves to show Shabini the scars on his arms, claiming they were from the night of the Quidditch final when his family had confronted a masked wizard. A burst of laughter erupted from the middle of the Ravenclaw table, and Harry, caught staring, quickly averted his gaze in embarrassment. None of the young wizards realized they were standing at the cusp of a new era. Ding, 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 the sweet desserts on the plates vanished, and a crisp knocking sound silenced the buzzing hall, leaving only the sound of the wind and rain. The young wizards were surprised to see Professor Blaine standing up from the staff table, while Dumbledore remained seated, smiling at them. Facing the curious and puzzled eyes below, Atticus smiled warmly. Welcome back to Hogwarts. Before we embark on a joyful new school year, there are a few announcements you need to be aware of. What's going on? Ron whispered to Harry, confused. Why is it Professor Blaine? Shh! Hermione, still fuming about the elves at Hogwarts, turned to them with a serious expression. Before the happy start of the new school year, there are some things that everyone must pay attention to. First of all, as always, students are not allowed to enter the Forbidden Forest, and in Hogsmeade Village, students below the 3rd grade are not permitted to visit. Dumbledore's opening speech was typically the same each year, and the senior students had grown weary of it. This year, however, there was a twist. Yet, Professor Blaine's words mirrored the usual announcements, causing disappointment among many senior wizards. Any new tricks, Professor Blaine? Fred called out, feeling a bit bored, only to receive a stern glare from Professor McGonagall. New tricks. Atticus blinked, adopting a humorous tone. Let me think. Ah, yes, after a review by the Student Safety Office, the number of items prohibited for use in the school has been reduced from 437 last year to 385. Of course, among the items some of the items have been released for use. While their use inside the castle remains illegal, they are permitted on the grounds outside. A detailed list is available in Mr. Filch's office for those interested. Atticus Blaine smiled at the Weasley twins, suspecting they were the only ones likely to take advantage of this change. Fred and George exchanged glances, their eyes filled with inexplicable excitement. Since their arrival at Hogwarts, Filch's list of prohibited items had grown alarmingly each year. This year, however, marked the first time the list had shrunk compared to the previous year. Could this mean a more relaxed environment at the school in the future? Guess what interesting things Professor Blaine will introduce to Hogwarts? Harry overheard Seamus whisper, followed by a quick response. There must be a big stink bomb. He's using it in class. In addition, I have some unfortunate news, Atticus continued from his position above. There will be no House Cup Quidditch game this year. The twin brothers, who had been brimming with excitement moments ago, suddenly froze, their mouths agape in shock. They weren't alone in their dismay. Apart from students like Cedric and Draco, who had heard the news earlier, most looked surprised and saddened. This is because a major event will commence in October, lasting throughout the school year, which will demand much of the professor's time and energy. But I assure you, it will be quite enjoyable. I'm pleased to announce that this year at Hogwarts. Professor Blaine's announcement was abruptly interrupted by a flash of lightning across the ceiling. Thunder roared outside the castle, shaking the glass windows, and the auditorium doors burst open. A man stood in the doorway, leaning on a long cane and wrapped in a black traveling cloak. The young wizards, eager for Professor Blaine to reveal the mystery, turned their attention to the stranger at the entrance. Another flash of lightning illuminated the man, revealing his long gray hair as he made his way toward the staff table. Who is he? Hermione wondered aloud. The lightning had vividly illuminated the man's face, which was unlike any she had seen before. It appeared as if carved from rotten wood by someone with only a vague idea of what a human face should look like, and lacking skill with a carving knife. His face was a tapestry of scars, his mouth a crooked gash, and where his nose should have been, there was only a flat expanse. Needless to say, he must be the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, Ron gasped. Look at that face. You can tell he's an expert in the dark arts. The most unsettling feature of the man who had interrupted the ceremony was not his face, but his eyes. One was small, while the other was large and round, like a coin, and a striking bright blue. The blue eye moved incessantly, darting up and down, left and right, independent of the normal eye. At one point, the blue eye rolled back into the man's head, revealing a large white eyeball. As the man approached, Dumbledore rose from his seat, greeting him with a smile, while Atticus cast a concerned glance at the stranger. This was Alastor Moody, reputed to be the finest Auror in the Ministry of Magic in recent years. After Voldemort's fall, he and his team had managed to dismantle some of the most stubborn resistance. Atticus knew of him from Dumbledore's previous reports, rather than personal experience. Atticus Blaine had become acquainted with the retired Auror. After graduating from Hogwarts and stepping into the wider world, he found that the head of the Auror office was none other than Rufus Scrimgeour. Alastor encountered a situation, so he arrived a little late, Dumbledore explained, exchanging a few words with Moody before turning his attention to Atticus. Perhaps you could introduce the children to their new professor for this school year. With pleasure, Atticus replied, nodding and smiling as he extended his hand to the legendary Auror, who scrutinized him several times with his magical eye. End of this chapter. Chapter 5-5, Reaction. The renowned Atticus Blaine. Moody's magical blue eye suddenly swiveled back, trembling wildly as it focused on Atticus. He extended his rough, large hand, grasping Atticus's in a firm handshake, muttering with a gravelly chuckle, "You took down the cunning werewolf leader and captured the dark witch who attacked the Quidditch match. Lately, the Daily Prophet seems to be your personal fan club." Hundreds of young wizards below craned their necks, curiously eyeing the staff table. It was clearly not the time for lengthy conversations. After exchanging pleasantries with Moody, Atticus turned back to the students, smiling warmly. "Allow me to introduce our new defense against the dark arts professor." Atticus feigned ignorance, as Moody quietly asked Dumbledore why he sensed a familiar aura of mischief about him. Nevertheless, he cheerfully addressed the young wizards, "Professor Moody." Typically, a new teacher would be met with applause and a warm welcome. However, this time, aside from Professor Dumbledore, Professor Blaine, and Hagrid, no one clapped. Those who did applaud soon realized their efforts echoed lonely in the silent hall, and they sheepishly lowered their hands. The rest seemed captivated by Moody's peculiar appearance, staring at him intently. "Moody," Harry whispered to Ron. "Mad-Eye Moody? Is he the one your father sent to help today?" "It must be him," Ron replied in a hushed, anxious tone. "What happened to him?" Hermione asked quietly. "What happened to his face?" The chilly atmosphere in the auditorium was not what Professor Blaine had hoped for. He coughed twice, maintaining his smile as he continued. "Professor Moody was an Auror before retiring, the most experienced in the Ministry of Magic over the past 50 years. His expertise in dealing with dark magic is unparalleled. I believe this year's Defense Against the Dark Arts class will be truly thrilling." Regardless of the situation, Professor Blaine's reputation commanded respect. Sparse applause rippled across the 4 long tables, and the young wizards whispered among themselves. The younger students were busy asking what an Auror was, while the older ones, familiar with the magical world, discussed Moody's legendary feats. Moody seemed unfazed by the curious stares. He settled into the empty seat reserved for him, ignoring the large can of pumpkin juice before him. Instead, he pulled out a curved flask and took a hearty swig. As he raised his arm to drink, his cloak lifted slightly, revealing his claw-shaped wooden prosthetic leg to many young wizards. "All right, back to the main topic." Atticus, feeling he had fulfilled his duty, cleared his throat once more. "As I mentioned earlier, in the coming months, Hogwarts will have the great honor of hosting a very exciting event, one that hasn't been held for over a century. I am thrilled to announce that the Tri-Wizard Tournament will take place at Hogwarts this year." "You've got to be kidding me," Fred Weasley shouted. The tense atmosphere that had gripped the auditorium since Moody's entrance was suddenly shattered. Laughter erupted, and Atticus glanced at Fred with a hint of appreciation before continuing. "Some of you may not be familiar with the Tri-Wizard Tournament, so I ask those who are to bear with me as I explain. This timeless competition was established around 700 years ago as a friendly contest between the three largest wizarding schools in Europe, Hogwarts, Beauxbatons, and Durmstrang. Each school selects a champion, and these three champions compete in three magical challenges. The Triwizard Tournament is held every 5 years, with the three schools taking turns hosting the event. It is widely regarded as an excellent opportunity for young wizards from different countries to forge friendships. Earlier this year, I encountered a young witch who might become a champion for Beauxbatons Academy of Magic. Her skills are impressive among young wizards, and she is eager to represent Hogwarts in the challenge. You must be fully prepared mentally for this. When Professor Blaine acknowledged the young witch, curiosity spread not only among the students from the 4 houses seated in the Great Hall, but also among the professors at the faculty table. Of course, I must clarify something first, Professor Blaine said, addressing the eager students. He tempered their excitement with a dose of reality. The Triwizard Tournament was previously halted due to the high number of casualties among participants. In the most severe incident, even the headmasters serving as judges were gravely injured. Therefore, when the Ministry of Magic's Department of International Magical Cooperation and the Department of Magical Sports proposed restarting the tournament to the International Confederation of Wizards, all parties agreed to impose an age restriction. Only wizards who are 17 years or older may register for the selection. A wave of disappointed sighs and protests swept through the auditorium. Ron, holding an uneaten chicken drumstick, shrugged and mumbled, "What a pity. Looks like we'll just have to watch the excitement." Harry nodded, casting a curious glance at Hermione, wondering how she would compare to the Beauxbatons witch praised by Professor Blaine. "And once you are chosen as a representative of the three schools, you will have the chance to win the Triwizard Tournament trophy for your school, along with a personal prize of 1,000 gold galleons," Professor Blaine announced. "This is not fair," Ron exclaimed, choking on his chicken and turning red as he struggled to swallow. His protest went unheard by Professor Blaine, as the hall was filled with too many voices of dissent. Even the Slytherin students, who usually supported Professor Blaine, were not convinced by this decision. On the Hufflepuff side, Harry noticed some students standing on their stools, loudly voicing their objections. "Do these people understand the situation?" Hermione frowned, glaring at the noisy students. Professor Blaine emphasized the dangers of this event. Consider that even wizards like Professor Dumbledore were injured trying to control certain elements of the tournament. Do they really think they can handle it? I believe the Ministry of Magic should require not only an age limit, but also a minimum OWL score. "Oh, shut up, Miss Granger," George Weasley retorted, turning to Hermione. He and Fred had faced difficulties over the summer due to their OWL results, and Hermione's mention of it only fueled his frustration. However, Hermione stood her ground, raising her chin defiantly and glaring back at George. "We have to find a way to overcome the obstacle, don't we?" Fred said, winking at those around him, including Harry and Ron. "I mean, if we can figure out a way, who wouldn't want to bring glory to Hogwarts?" Fred's suggestion was met with enthusiasm from many students. Even Neville nodded hesitantly, only to be met with Hermione's surprised and angry stare. "My grandma will definitely insist that I participate," Neville said, his voice tinged with resignation. "She always tells me it's my duty to uphold the family honor." He lowered his head, his expression filled with shame as he silently pleaded for Hermione's understanding. End of this chapter. Chapter 506, Introduction Letter. The first day of school at Hogwarts always brings a variety of unexpected situations. After a summer of leisure, the young wizards find themselves thrust back into the rigorous demands of academic life. Eager to catch up with friends and discuss their summer adventures, many stay up late, leading to a predictable rush and tardiness the following morning. First-year students, unfamiliar with the castle's labyrinthine corridors, often find themselves lost. The moving staircases, a notorious feature of Hogwarts, add to their confusion, sometimes causing mishaps that result in trips to the school hospital. Throughout the morning, the house deans, along with Madame Pomfrey and Filch, are kept busy, rushing up and down the stairs to manage the chaos. Even Dumbledore, with his characteristic twinkle, gently guides two wayward first-years back to their classroom. However, none of this affects Atticus Blaine. Unlike his peers, Atticus spent his summer in constant motion, attending to various responsibilities without a moment's rest. Ironically, the start of the school year brings him a sense of calm. He wakes naturally in the morning, leisurely collects some food from the Great Hall, and heads to the restricted section of the library to peruse a couple of books. Afterward, he returns to his office, savoring a delicious breakfast while continuing his reading. It isn't until 9:30 a.m. that he begins to address his official duties. One of his tasks includes writing a note to Hagrid, requesting the purchase of panoramic telescopes and alchemical materials in preparation for the Tri-Wizard tournament. Atticus had previously submitted a safety plan to the International Wizards Federation's Competition Review Committee, proposing a novel approach to ensure contestant safety and provide spectators with a real-time, engaging view of the tournament. This plan relies heavily on his surveillance cameras. The previous batch, assembled and disassembled over the past 2 years, had suffered damage, particularly from an incident involving Ginny, who had been possessed by a fragment of Riddle's soul. Consequently, about half of the cameras were no longer functional. At Hogwarts, Hagrid is responsible for most of the purchasing, especially for the more specialized class supplies used by professors. Dumbledore's choice of Hagrid for this role is astute. Entrusting Filch with such tasks would likely result in financial discrepancies. Much like Dumbledore, who spends considerable time in his office, Atticus dedicates his days to responding to a flood of correspondence. Since gaining fame for defeating the werewolf pack led by Greyback earlier in the year, the volume of letters he receives has increased exponentially. These letters come from admirers, esteemed wizards seeking academic discourse, and various official organizations. As an honorary advisor on magic, Atticus regularly receives updates from the Ministry of Magic, ostensibly seeking his counsel on recent decisions, though these are often mere briefings. Unlike Lockhart, Atticus cannot reply to every letter, but he prioritizes those of significance. For instance, a whimsical old goblin from Gringotts Paris headquarters recently inquired about advertising opportunities at the Tri-Wizard tournament, offering generous rewards to Hogwarts in return. Atticus Blaine assured himself that his support would not be forgotten. He was indeed seeking funds for Hogwarts, and Barna's proposal was tempting. However, after careful consideration, he decided to decline the offer in his response. It wasn't that he doubted his ability to persuade Dumbledore or find a way to discreetly channel the funds through the school board. Rather, the Tri-Wizard tournament was being held for the first time in over a century, and Atticus hoped to keep commercial influences to a minimum. If they were to exist, they should not be overt. Atticus had originally planned to stay in for the day, using the afternoon to refine the curriculum for the next phase of his physical education class. However, an unexpected letter from Sirius prompted him to leave his office and head to Hogsmeade, specifically to the Three Broomsticks. After the bar owner, Ms. Rosmerta, set down a cup of green tea and left the room, delighted with her newly acquired autograph, Sirius eagerly asked, "How is Harry? Is he still upset?" "How would I know?" Atticus retorted, rolling his eyes. "I'm not the boy's nanny." Sirius had intended to send Harry to Hogwarts from the overseas crossing station the previous day, but uncertainty about whether Harry was still angry with him caused him to hesitate and miss the opportunity, Remus explained with a smile, sipping his syrupy soda. "By the time I arrived, the Hogwarts Express had already left," Sirius exclaimed, slapping the table in frustration. "I'm quite busy," Atticus replied, unfazed. "I'm not here to listen to how you plan to mend the rift between you and Harry." Atticus is right, Sirius. Today is the first day of school at Hogwarts. Every professor has a lot on their plate. We shouldn't take up too much of his time. Let's get to the point, Remus said, suppressing a smile and sitting up straight. After noticing that Atticus wasn't annoyed by his mention of Dumbledore, Remus continued, "Albus advised me not to let Harry's situation trap me. If I believe what you asked me to do has value, then I should proceed." Atticus nodded slightly, having anticipated that Remus would discuss these matters with Dumbledore. He had already spoken to Dumbledore the previous night. Sirius, too, seemed to have made the same decision. Here are 2 letters of introduction, Atticus said, handing them to Sirius. Without drawing attention, show the first one to Amelia Bones, then take the other to Fudge. Sirius took the letters, examining them curiously before looking at Atticus with a puzzled expression. Is this really okay? I mean, are you sure you don't need to speak to the Minister of Magic directly? Don't worry, it's fine, Atticus replied calmly. Cornelius Fudge will understand my intentions. If I make the request in person, it would put him in an awkward position. But Mrs. Bones is known for her fairness in the wizarding world. Would she be comfortable with Sirius taking this route into the Auror office? And what about Rufus Scrimgeour? Remus inquired. Justice is often situational, Atticus explained patiently. Although Amelia is the director of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, her influence over the Ministry's elite magical forces is limited. My letter simply informs her that Sirius comes with my endorsement. She will understand and support it. As for Rufus Scrimgeour, this matter only requires Fudge's approval. It's not his concern yet. Atticus paused, looking at Sirius, who was listening intently. Don't overthink it. Once you're in the Auror office, things will fall into place. Just do your best in the office. If anything comes up, feel free to write to me at any time, Atticus Blaine advised the 2 individuals, emphasizing the key points they needed to remember. Glancing at the sky, he noticed that dinner at Hogwarts was about to commence. With a quick farewell, he departed hastily, leaving Sirius and Remus seated together. The others in the room exchanged glances, their emotions a mix of curiosity and concern. When I was the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor at Hogwarts earlier this year, I discussed with some young Gryffindor students the Newt scores required to become an Auror, Sirius remarked, holding the letter of introduction and shaking his head thoughtfully. That's because the Ministry of Magic is well aware that they lack the means to control a wizard like Atticus, who is still in his early 20s. Remus wore a similarly complex expression. We should consider ourselves fortunate that Atticus is on our side. Otherwise, even with Albus. The Ministry of Magic feels much more secure with Dumbledore, Sirius interjected, a contemptuous smile playing on his lips. They probably believe that Dumbledore's reputation is his only weapon, thinking, he's too old to wield a wand effectively. End of this chapter. Chapter 507, Harry's Accusation. Although the storm had subsided, the first day of school was far from pleasant for Harry. The morning's herbology class with the Hufflepuffs was uneventful. Professor Sprout had them extract pus from the roots of a slug-like plant, which, despite its unpleasantness, was known for its high medicinal value. However, the Care of Magical Creatures class later that morning took a turn for the worse. As expected, Hagrid had another surprise in store. He introduced them to a creature even more interesting than the hippogriff, the blast-ended Scroot. This creature could breathe fire, sting with the spines on its shell, and had a penchant for biting smaller creatures. Needless to say, no one left Hagrid's class unscathed. The afternoon divination class offered Harry no useful knowledge, only a pile of homework that would consume his weekend. As the school day ended, the entrance hall was bustling with students queuing for dinner. Harry and Ron joined the line, their spirits low, while Hermione descended the stairs, her arms laden with tomes. She immediately noticed Harry and Ron's gloomy expressions at the back of the crowd. "What's going on? Are you going to eat first?" Hermione asked, surprised. "Don't we usually finish Professor Blaine's running exercises before dinner?" Perhaps it was the exercise that had made Hermione stronger, allowing her to carry more books. Harry noticed that since the start of school, Hermione seemed to be carrying an even larger load. Not only did she have a pile in her arms, but her school bag was also stuffed to the brim. A casual glance revealed that these books were clearly not meant for fourth-year students. Harry was about to respond to Hermione's question when Ron interjected. "Harry needs to rest, Hermione, to recover from this exhausting day and to reminisce about the weekend that ended before it even began." Harry nodded in agreement. Hermione raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed with Ron's excuse, but understanding that normal young wizards needed time to adjust, she said nothing and joined the queue. "Weasley! Hello, Weasley!" A sharp voice suddenly called from behind. As a physical education assistant, Hermione was about to remind Harry that he couldn't use excuses to skip post-meal training when they all turned to see Malfoy entering the hall with Crabbe and Goyle. Malfoy was out of breath, with a few strands of hair plastered to his forehead, indicating he had just returned from Quidditch practice. Typically, Malfoy would target Harry, but this time he bypassed him and went straight for Ron, which was unusual. Harry and Hermione exchanged quick glances with Ron, their eyes catching the newspaper in Malfoy's hand. Instinctively, they sensed it contained something unfavorable about Ron. "What?" Ron asked warily, sensing trouble. "There's something interesting," Malfoy announced, a smug smile playing on his lips. He cleared his throat and spoke loudly enough for everyone in the hall to hear. "There's new trouble at the Ministry of Magic," our special correspondent Rita Skeeter reports. Due to the peculiar behavior of Arnold Weasley from the Office for the Prohibition of the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts, the Ministry has found itself embroiled in a Quidditch scandal and a new embarrassment following the mysterious disappearance of a female employee. The name Arnold Weasley barely registered with Harry. What caught his attention was female employee disappeared. Mr. Weasley and Professor Blaine had not informed the Ministry of Magic about this. The news of Bertha Jo King's death at the hands of Voldemort spread quickly among the staff and students of Hogwarts. Many, including Hermione, subscribed to the Daily Prophet. When Malfoy raised his head to share the news, Hermione grabbed Ron's sleeve and whispered, "Come on, Ron. Ignore Malfoy. He's just a boring clown." However, Ron was determined to hear Malfoy out, frowning and standing his ground. Hermione, realizing she couldn't sway Ron, looked to Harry for help. But to her surprise, Harry was listening intently to Malfoy. After a moment, Malfoy folded the newspaper and displayed a photo to the gathered students, half of whom were silent while the others pointed at Ron. Malfoy grinned, showing his white teeth. "Look at this. A photo of your parents standing at the door of your house. You actually call this a house. If your mother could lose some weight, she might look decent, right?" Ron trembled with rage, and all eyes in the foyer were on him. "Go away, Malfoy," Harry finally said, snapping out of his trance and understanding Hermione's silent plea. "Don't be angry, Ron." "Hey, Potter, what did you do at the Quidditch World Cup?" Malfoy taunted. "Your big head looks more interesting than usual. It's a pity the Daily Prophet didn't capture it." "Really?" Harry replied coldly. "What about your parents, Malfoy? Should they also make an appearance and plan a naughty little activity for the Quidditch final? If they report it, whatever background you use, your house is definitely not suitable. I think Azkaban is pretty good." The noisy foyer fell silent. Everyone turned their attention to Harry, taking a few seconds to grasp what he was implying. "Shut up, Harry," Hermione said nervously, noticing the stunned expressions around them. "This isn't the place to discuss such things. There's no evidence, and—" "How dare you slander my parents, Potter?" Malfoy's pale face flushed slightly. He understood Harry's insinuation, but looked incredulous, as if he truly didn't know. "Why? Your parents didn't tell you their naughty little plan, did they?" The focus shifted from Ron to Harry's insinuations. Even Ron realized the cause of the tense atmosphere. Hermione approached the two boys, grabbed an arm each, and dragged them away without a word. "Wait, explain yourself, Potter," Malfoy shouted. "Shut your mouth, Malfoy," Hermione yelled angrily, pulling Harry and Ron along. Suddenly, there was a loud bang. Several people screamed as something white-hot brushed past Harry's cheek. He reached for his wand, but before he could draw it, a roar echoed through the foyer. "Oh, don't do that, boy!" Harry, Hermione, and Ron turned sharply to see Professor Moody limping down the marble stairs, wand in hand, eyes fixed on the door, looking slightly surprised. "You're hiding pretty well, kid, but I want to see where you're going to hide." Harry's attention shifted to the door, where the marble floor tile Malfoy had been standing on was now smoking. Crabbe and Goyle stood frozen in fear, while Malfoy, terrified, was making a hasty retreat towards the door. "Did he hurt you?" Moody asked Harry angrily, his voice low and hoarse. "No," Harry replied dully. "No hit." Moody quickly moved past Harry, shoving aside the petrified Crabbe and Goyle. With a grim expression, he raised his wand high and, as he stepped out the door, brought it down with force. A powerful gust surged from the doorway into the foyer, blowing Harry back slightly. Atticus Blaine struggled to keep his eyes open, the fatigue weighing heavily on him. Behind him, a group of young wizards waiting in line gasped in surprise. "What happened?" Hermione asked urgently, as soon as she regained her balance. Moody stood motionless at the castle door, his wand aimed at the marble steps outside. "What are you doing?" Atticus, positioned at the bottom of the stairs, glanced at Draco, who was cowering behind him, visibly frightened. Raising an eyebrow, Atticus lowered his wand and looked calmly toward the door. "Professor Moody?" he inquired. End of this chapter. Chapter 508. "Get out of the way, Blaine!" Moody growled, his magical eye fixed intently on Atticus Blaine. "I need to teach this despicable boy a lesson." Atticus narrowed his eyes slightly, not at Moody's harsh words, but at the unsettling gaze of his magical eye. Atticus, well versed in alchemy, recognized the intricate array of magical patterns engraved within the eye. It continuously stirred magic to detect the surroundings and relay the information back to its user. While most wizards found the eye intimidating, Atticus, with his innate and powerful magic-sensing abilities, perceived it as an intrusive magnifying glass attempting to strip him bare. The discomfort was palpable. "Help, Professor Blaine!" Draco's voice quivered as he peeked out from behind Atticus. Clearly terrified by Moody's fierce demeanor, his face was pale, and tears glistened in his eyes. "This madman wants to kill me!" With a swift motion, Moody's wand emitted a rope as thick as a thumb. The rope, once free from the wand's tip, coiled and lunged forward, aiming to ensnare Draco's neck and pull him away from Atticus. However, without even turning, Atticus flicked his wand with a deft backhand. Before the students emerging from the hall could comprehend the scene, the rope conjured by Moody dissipated into a wisp of black smoke, carried away by the wind. "You must understand," Atticus said, turning to face Moody with a stern gaze. "This is no longer a joke, Professor Moody." "Oh, are you going to protect this scumbag, Blaine?" Moody's irritation flared at Atticus's warning, rather than being deterred. He stepped over the threshold, advancing to the top of the marble stairs, his wand pointed menacingly at Atticus and Draco. "I want to see how you plan to stop me." Atticus's expression darkened. Standing firm, he moved his wrist with precision. A red ball of light, as large as a quaffle and crackling with red electricity, erupted from his wand, trailing a fiery tail as it soared above the marble stairs. "Oh, the spell!" Angelina from the Gryffindor team gasped, covering her mouth in surprise as she watched from the doorway. Moody's magical eye trembled, and the red ball of light suspended in midair began to ripple. Suddenly, Moody waved his wand, conjuring countless red sparks like shattered stars before him. But the barrage of red curse lights from the ball was relentless. Though Moody managed to block them, the force of the curses was overwhelming. Bang, bang, bang! The young wizards watching from the foyer could only stare as Moody, despite his efforts, was pushed back step by the powerful curses. Atticus's spell forced him back into the foyer. "What is going on here?" A voice of surprise echoed from the stairs at the side of the foyer. It was Professor McGonagall, clutching a few books, her eyes wide with astonishment at the scene unfolding before her. With a snap, the light ball vanished from the air. Moody clung to the towering doorframe, breathing heavily, his scarred face twitching with exertion. Professor McGonagall nearly twisted her ankle as she hurried down the stairs. Fortunately, Colin, who was holding a camera, was there to steady her. After a quick apology to Colin, she pushed her way through the crowd and approached. Upon reaching Moody's side, she scrutinized him from head to toe, ensuring he was intact. Taking a deep breath, her voice quivered with anger. "Atticus, Alaster, what on earth is going on here?" "He tried to kill me!" Draco, ever the opportunist, darted out from behind Atticus, pointing at Moody and shouting, "It was this lunatic, Professor Blaine, who defended me." "You're lying, Malfoy," Ron shouted, his voice echoing, "You attacked Harry first." "Silence!" Professor McGonagall's face was ashen. She glanced at Atticus and Alaster, who were still locked in a tense stare, then turned her attention to Hermione. "Miss Granger, you witnessed everything, correct? Explain." Ron discreetly nudged Hermione's arm, only to receive a stern glare from Professor McGonagall. With so many witnesses, Hermione had no choice but to recount the entire incident. "The first day of school isn't even over, and this happens," Professor McGonagall fumed. 20 points from Slytherin, Malfoy, and 2 days of detention. I'll inform Severus to handle your punishment." Before Harry could feel any relief, he noticed Professor McGonagall's gaze shift to him, and his heart sank. "The same goes for you, Potter," she declared. Then, addressing the growing crowd of students, she commanded, "Everyone, go eat. Don't linger here." No one dared defy the furious Professor McGonagall. The young wizards quickly dispersed, including Harry and Draco, who, at Atticus's signal, hurried into the great hall, disheartened. "Professor Moody!" With the hall finally empty, Professor McGonagall pursed her lips and fixed her gaze on Moody, who had regained his composure. "Regarding your use of magic against students, it was merely a transfiguration spell. I thought it would give that despicable boy a scare he'd remember," Moody replied dismissively. "Transfiguration is not acceptable either," Professor McGonagall said warily. "If a student's behavior warrants punishment, we can deduct points, assign detention, or report it to the head of their house. I'm sure Dumbledore would agree." "Perhaps," Moody muttered, taking several swigs from a flask at his waist. He eyed Atticus warily as he ascended the marble stairs, as if expecting him to raise his wand again. "And Atticus," Professor McGonagall began, frowning as she searched for the right words. After a moment, she continued, "Next time, assess the situation before acting. Professor Moody is your colleague, not a dark wizard." "As for that, I reserve my judgment," Atticus replied coolly. He was indifferent to how Draco had once again embroiled himself in trouble with Harry and his friends. They always seemed to find reasons to clash. However, there were certain things he needed to address. "Professor Moody, you may still carry some habits from your past career, but not everyone appreciates being scrutinized. As the director of the Student Safety Office at Hogwarts, I must clarify the explanation you just provided." The decision to reprimand Atticus Blaine for actively confronting Draco Malfoy is not entirely satisfactory. "I believe it is necessary for me to review your daily teaching practices. If I find the content lacking, I will not hesitate to consider your dismissal from Hogwarts." "You're threatening." Moody's face flushed with anger, and he instinctively prepared to retaliate. However, for some inexplicable reason, when faced with Atticus Blaine's impassive expression, he hesitated mid-sentence. Ultimately, he abruptly spat out the word welcome before turning on his heel and leaving. "Alastor was invited by Albus, Atticus. We should at least be cordial." Professor McGonagall interjected, clearly favoring Atticus in this matter, yet still feeling compelled to voice her concern. "I've taken that into account, Professor McGonagall," Atticus replied, spreading his hands in a gesture of innocence. End of this chapter. Chapter 509. Worry. The duel between Professor Blaine and Professor Moody unfolded in the foyer of the auditorium just before dinner. Many young wizards witnessed the spectacle, and those who missed it soon heard about it during dinner discussions. The students were less concerned with the cause of the conflict and more intrigued by the duel itself. It was no surprise that Professor Blaine emerged victorious. His remarkable performances over the past 2 years made the idea of him losing to anyone almost unthinkable. Professor Moody was absent from the staff table, leading some to speculate that he was too embarrassed to show up after his defeat. However, Neville, who returned breathless from the Quidditch field, informed everyone that Professor Moody was patrolling the campus. "No wonder Dad holds Professor Moody in such high regard," Ron remarked to those around him. "You know what I mean." "Of course we do, you little fool," George replied kindly. Harry, meanwhile, was lost in thought, staring intently at the pattern on the silver cup before him. Hermione noticed his mood and asked quietly, "What are you thinking about, Harry? Is it because of Professor Blaine helping Malfoy?" "I don't understand," Harry began, his words tumbling out. "Did you read what that reporter Skeeter wrote in the Daily Prophet? The Ministry of Magic still claims Bertha Jorkins is just missing. But how can that be? With Professor Blaine's help, they captured Cleona, didn't they? If they interrogated her, they should know Voldemort killed her. And they still say Cleona was with the masked men, but they clearly don't know each other. Even if they went in the wrong direction, Professor Blaine knows everything. But—" "Oh, shut up, Harry," Hermione interrupted, her eyes darting nervously to the top of the auditorium. "Professor Blaine is here! Alastor has fought against evil all his life, and as you can see, he has suffered greatly in this long struggle, Atticus," Dumbledore said, addressing the earlier incident in the hall. Though no one had reported it to him, he seemed to know everything. He patiently reassured Atticus. His tolerance for certain behaviors is very low. Of course, using magic to punish a young wizard is inappropriate, but it doesn't mean he lacks emotional control as you think. Haha, our beloved headmaster is always tolerant of those with special talents, Snape interjected with a sarcastic smile. But be careful, Atticus. That lunatic sees everyone as a dark wizard except for Dumbledore. Your good reputation means nothing to him. He might even request to search your office and suitcase next. Atticus looked at Professor Snape with mild surprise. Has Professor Moody made such a request of you? Snape's lips thinned and his expression darkened. Dumbledore, aware of the situation, looked at Snape with slight apology. I've assured Alastor that you can be trusted, Severus. Oh, it's such an honor to have your trust, Headmaster Dumbledore, Snape replied coldly. Neither Atticus nor Professor Snape would change their opinions of Mad-Eye Moody based on a few words. Dumbledore understood this well, and after a helpless sigh, he fell silent. The atmosphere in the auditorium remained tense as the students and staff processed the day's events. The atmosphere at the faculty table was tense, and Atticus Blaine found it uncomfortable. After dabbing the corners of his mouth with a napkin, he stood up and left. Instead of heading back to his office, he strolled down the Great Hall towards the Gryffindor table. As he passed, conversations at the table seemed to hush, as if silenced by a spell, and the young wizards watched him with curiosity. "Could I have a word, Harry?" Atticus asked, standing behind Harry. "Oh, of course, Professor Blaine," Harry replied, quickly getting to his feet. "And you, Hermione, I have something to discuss with you as well. Please come to my office," Atticus added, noticing Hermione, who was focused on pouring gravy over her baked potatoes but had her ears perked up. Hermione and Harry prompted till I stood and followed Professor Blaine out of the hall. Across the table, Ron, realizing he hadn't been included, set down his utensils with a sigh and puffed his cheeks in disappointment as he watched them leave. Though it was only September, the late autumn winds were already sweeping through the ancient castle of Hogwarts, nestled among the mountains and dark waters. The chill made Harry and Hermione shiver, but the weather had little effect on a powerful wizard like Atticus. As they walked through the second-floor corridor, Atticus paused, gazing out at the expansive lawn, squinting for a few moments before continuing. "Professor Moody," Harry whispered to Hermione, surprised to see the limping figure patrolling the grounds by the light of Hagrid's cabin. "He's still on patrol?" They were familiar with Professor Blaine's office, so they needed no directions. Once inside, Harry and Hermione made their way to the sofa, while Professor Blaine joined them, choosing not to sit at his desk. "Here's the thing," Atticus began, looking at Harry. "I met Sirius in Hogsmeade this afternoon." Harry's eyes widened with anticipation. Atticus settled into the soft sofa, smiling. He had two main reasons for visiting. First, he wanted me to convey his apology for the argument you had over the summer. "Why didn't he tell me himself?" Harry asked, a hint of anger in his voice. "Well, I didn't ask," Atticus replied, smiling knowingly at Harry's rebellious expression. "But I suspect he thought you wouldn't want to hear it directly from him." Harry, his face flushed with embarrassment, pretended not to notice Hermione stifling a laugh. He quickly changed the subject. "What's the second thing, Professor Blaine?" "The second matter doesn't directly involve you, but since Sirius is your godfather, you have the right to know," Atticus said, his tone turning serious. "Sirius has decided to join the Ministry of Magic as an Auror. You know what an Auror is, Harry. Professor Moody was one before he retired." Harry nodded instinctively, but as the realization sank in, his eyes widened in shock. "Sirius became an Auror? How could that happen? Why would he even consider it?" "It's not surprising," Atticus explained. "Sirius is a skilled and energetic wizard. Now that he's cleared his name, it's natural for him to seek a role where he can make a difference. Consider Headmaster Dumbledore, who remains dedicated even at over 110 years old." "But," Harry began, closing his mouth as his green eyes flickered with concern in the warm glow of the room. Being an Auror meant battling dark wizards, a perilous job. From Professor Moody, Harry had a clear sense of the dangers involved. Sirius wasn't like Professor Blaine or Professor Dumbledore, who could handle any situation with ease. Just like the night of During the Quidditch final, Sirius faced a challenging situation with 3 masked wizards who appeared in their box. If it hadn't been for Cleona's assistance, something terrible might have happened to him that night. Harry suddenly felt a surge of urgency and rushed back to the dormitory to write to Sirius, urging him to choose wisely. However, he paused, realizing that since Sirius had already made his decision, he should support it. These conflicting thoughts battled in Harry's mind, leaving him momentarily indecisive. Atticus Blaine didn't say anything further to Harry. Instead, he turned his attention directly to Hermione. "Hermione, I came to ask about the progress of everyone's training in the course," he inquired. End of this chapter. Chapter 510, Clarifications. Training situation? Hermione pondered aloud, trying to understand why Sirius had suddenly entered the Ministry of Magic. From their previous interactions, it was clear that Sirius didn't hold Cornelius Fudge, the Minister of Magic, in high regard. Her curiosity piqued. She asked the question, almost subconsciously, and then realization dawned on her. Training situation. Oh, that's it! Hermione's body tensed with nervous anticipation. Facing Professor Atticus Blaine, she quickly reviewed everyone's progress in training. However, instead of feeling reassured, she felt a twinge of embarrassment. "No one has managed to reach the finish line under the assault of the big dung bombs, Professor," she admitted, bracing herself for the expected reprimand. But Professor Blaine merely nodded slightly, his gaze steady on her. Hermione took a deep breath to calm her nerves and proceeded to detail the performance of most participants. Surprisingly, Hufflepuff's Cedric Diggory was no longer the top performer. He had only managed to secure 3rd place. Luna had come closest to the finish line without being hit by the big dung bombs, followed by Neville. Of course, her and Harry's performances were also commendable. Atticus Blaine wasn't particularly surprised by these results, though he did express a hint of disappointment. "I had initially planned to conclude your training by the first half of the school year, but it seems we may need to extend the timeline," he remarked, noticing Hermione's downcast eyes and clenched fists. "There's no need to feel guilty, Hermione. I'm not blaming you. This task was never meant to be easy. That's why I chose the young wizards I believed were the best for this challenge. There will be new course content introduced soon." Both Harry and Hermione had greatly benefited from Professor Blaine's class. Without this training, who knows what might have happened on the night of the Quidditch final. Neither of them took Professor Blaine's lessons lightly. Upon hearing that new content would be introduced, Harry's curiosity was piqued, and he looked at Professor Blaine with eager anticipation. "I'll reveal more on Wednesday night. For now, you can return to your tasks," Professor Blaine said with a smile, choosing not to divulge any secrets just yet. Realizing it was time to leave, Harry and Hermione rose and headed for the door. However, as Harry's hand touched the cold door handle, a lingering question came to mind. This was a rare opportunity to seek answers from someone who knew so much. If he didn't ask now, he might never resolve his confusion. "Professor Blaine?" Harry turned back to see Professor Blaine preparing some bitter tea by the fireplace. "May I ask you a few questions?" "It is a professor's duty to help students resolve their doubts. I see no issue with that," Professor Blaine replied, blowing gently on the floating leaves in his teacup, a smile on his face. Hermione immediately understood that Harry's question wasn't about magic. He was still pondering what had been discussed in the auditorium earlier, and she didn't stop him because she shared his confusion. "About Bertha Jorkins," Harry began, summoning his courage. "You know she's dead, right? The witch who was killed by Voldemort. She was captured and imprisoned in Azkaban by you. She knew about it, but the newspaper says the Ministry of Magic still considers Bertha Jorkins missing." Atticus Blaine was silent for a few moments, then smiled and said, "I suspect you're confused about more than just this. Why don't you share all your questions?" So, Harry and Hermione, who had been about to leave, returned to the sofa. After listening to Harry's series of questions, Atticus Blaine took a moment before responding. Atticus Blaine lowered his head, his fingertips tracing the rim of the steaming cup. His deep lavender eyes were fixed on a solitary green leaf, floating and swirling in the water. After a prolonged silence, he spoke softly. What do you think the purpose of an organization like the Ministry of Magic is? Harry blinked, puzzled by Professor Blaine's question, while Hermione's frown eased as she pondered. The Ministry of Magic is responsible for managing wizards, Professor. I believe its purpose is to maintain order. If this were a class, I'd certainly award you 5 points, Hermione. Atticus nodded, casting an admiring glance at the perceptive young witch. Indeed, the Ministry's purpose is to uphold order in the wizarding world, to ensure stability. And at the heart of all your questions lies one name, Voldemort. Hermione pursed her lips, her shoulders tensing slightly. But what does that mean? Harry still seemed lost. He's still alive. Many people know that. Knowing doesn't equate to facing reality, Atticus replied calmly. Most believe that although Voldemort isn't dead, he's been utterly defeated by you. They think he's hiding in some dark corner abroad, too afraid to return. But if they realized Voldemort isn't as weak as they assume, and that he might one day regain his power and return, panic would ensue. The Ministry of Magic is made up of ordinary wizards who can't accept this either. Surely you know, apart from a select few, how terrified wizards are of him? Harry fell silent, recalling the night of his 11th birthday when Hagrid revealed his true identity as a wizard. That night, Hagrid had reluctantly uttered Voldemort. His fear palpable. One person's panic might not cause much, but widespread fear could lead to chaos. You might think deceiving the public is disgraceful, but the panic from revealing the truth could lead to societal collapse, with far graver consequences. Young wizards often held idealistic views, with a strong aversion to deceit. Lies aren't always shameful, Atticus explained patiently, though neither Hermione nor Harry grasped his next point. Not until it's time to accept everything. Despite knowing Hermione for over 3 years, Harry sometimes found her stubbornness exasperating. After leaving Professor Blaine's office, he was eager to return to the dormitory to discuss the evening's revelations with Ron. However, Hermione insisted on dragging him to the Quidditch pitch for a run, delaying their return to the castle until the Great Hall was deserted. "If I were you, I wouldn't wander around the grounds in the dark," came a voice in the hall. Harry and Hermione encountered Professor Moody, who had evidently seen them running earlier. Professor Moody seemed unfazed by his recent defeat to Professor Blaine in front of the students. His demeanor was calmer, though his mismatched eyes still roved restlessly. "Someone might be lurking in the shadows, ready to snatch your liver." Harry felt a twinge of embarrassment, unsure if Professor Moody was jesting. "It's part of our daily routine, Professor Moody," Hermione replied timidly, finding Mad-Eye Moody's presence a bit overwhelming. "We intended to finish earlier, but Professor Blaine—" Hermione abruptly stopped speaking, realizing it might not be appropriate to mention Professor Blaine in front of Professor Moody. "Ah, Blaine!" Professor Moody fixed his magical eye on Harry, asking with keen interest, "What did he talk to you about?" There was no need for Hermione to discreetly remind Harry not to disclose his conversation with Professor Blaine. Harry assumed Professor Moody might be displeased, but to his surprise, Moody nodded approvingly. "Yes, Potter, secrets should be kept close to your heart." As Professor Moody turned to leave, he paused at the stairs and suddenly shouted, "Stay vigilant at all times." "It's no wonder they call him Mad-Eye Moody, is it?" Harry remarked, still shaken by Moody's parting shout. "He does seem a bit unhinged." Hermione, however, didn't echo Harry's sentiment. Instead, she gazed thoughtfully at the stairs. "Professor Moody was just in the Forbidden Forest," she mused. "But what was he doing there? Hagrid is usually the one responsible for patrolling the Forbidden Forest." "How do you know that?" Harry asked, surprised. "Didn't you notice, Harry? There are leaves stuck to the soles of his shoes." Hermione replied in a tone that suggested it was obvious. "Those leaves are only found in the Forbidden Forest." End of this chapter. Chapter 511, Traditions and Truths. For many years, it has been a tradition at Hogwarts for each of the 4 houses to welcome new students in their own unique way after the sorting ceremony. Slytherin freshmen engage in duels to determine the best among them. Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff have their own distinctive methods of greeting newcomers, while Gryffindor opts for the simplest approach, a grand banquet. Perhaps due to the absence of Percy, the more serious student union president, When Harry and Hermione returned to the common room, they found that Fred and George had brought a heap of food from the kitchen. The chandeliers still hung from the ceiling, adorned with ribbons from the previous night's festivities, which seemed to continue unabated. Amidst the lively crowd, Harry spotted Ron. Unlike the others, Ron wasn't partaking in the revelry. Instead, he was engaged in a serious conversation with his two brothers at a round coffee table. "Want to join them, Harry?" Hermione asked softly, having noticed Ron as well. "I'm going back to the dormitory to write a letter to Sirius," Harry replied after a moment's hesitation. He then headed towards the spiral staircase leading to the boys' dormitory. As Harry's figure disappeared around the corner, Hermione turned away, pursing her lips with a soft sigh. She sensed that Harry was in low spirits, not just because Sirius had joined the Ministry of Magic without informing him, but more so due to Professor Atticus Blaine's revelations about the world earlier that evening. These revelations had clearly impacted Harry's emotions. In truth, Hermione herself felt her worldview shaken by Professor Blaine's assertion that stability is more important than truth. While she didn't fully agree with his perspective, she valued that Professor Blaine was the only one among the professors who, besides teaching magical skills, was willing to discuss real life and the magical world with his students. This was something Hermione found particularly valuable. "Oh, you're back?" Ginny greeted Hermione as she approached, her eyes searching Hermione's face for answers. "Harry's gone to write a letter to Sirius and has already returned to his dormitory," Hermione explained, shaking her curly hair in response to Ginny's unspoken question. She noticed Neville, who was with Ginny, also looking at her with curiosity and a more serious expression. "Professor Blaine thinks our training is progressing a bit slowly, Neville," Hermione said, her tone serious. Neville's face fell, and he asked anxiously, "Professor Blaine said that? What does it mean? Are we going to be expelled? Hermione, will he stop us from attending class?" "That's not it," Hermione reassured him, crossing her arms. "But he doesn't want us to waste all our time on this training. He mentioned that new things will be taught in his class." "What could it be?" Ginny asked, her interest piqued. "Oh," Neville said, looking disappointed. "I always thought this training was quite interesting." In the following 2 days, nothing significant occurred, except for Neville's mishap in potions class, where he burned yet another cauldron, his 6th in recent years. Snape, showing no mercy, detained Neville, and it was on a Wednesday night. Determined not to miss Professor Blaine's evening lecture, Neville stayed in the basement after potions class, even skipping dinner. By the time Neville returned, all the students participating in the experimental course had already gathered. "What's going on, Neville?" Harry asked in surprise, noticing Neville's disheveled appearance and apparent exhaustion. "What did that old bat Snape make you do?" "A bucket of horned toads," Neville began, his voice trailing off. Atticus Blaine stretched out his trembling hand. His skin had turned pale from being soaked, and his fingernails were filled with brown, foul-smelling residue. The wizard's task had been unpleasant, and those around him instinctively covered their noses, stepping back from one another. "He made me sort through toad entrails and wouldn't to let me use magic." Neville's eyes brimmed with tears. He swayed slightly, fighting the urge to vomit. "Didn't you tell him that Professor Blaine has a class tonight?" Ginny asked, her voice tinged with anger. "I didn't dare," Neville replied, casting a grateful glance at Hermione, who was using a descaling spell to clean the stubborn remnants from his fingernails. "I was afraid if I mentioned it, he'd make me disembowel myself and still forbid magic." Since Neville had entered the room, Malfoy had been watching with a mocking expression. Hearing Neville's words, he burst into laughter. Harry shot him a glare just as the classroom door clicked open. Professor Atticus Blaine, clad in his wizard's robe, entered swiftly. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Professor Blaine greeted, moving to the front of the 4, quickly forming groups. He surveyed the students' faces. After the summer break, many had shed their youthful immaturity, appearing calmer and exuding a vibrant energy. Seeing the students' reverent gazes, Atticus felt a renewed vitality in his own spirit. "I'm glad to see you all have the courage to attend this class," he said in a lively tone. "Before we begin, I have 2 announcements. Considering the previous physical education classes took up too much of your after-school time, we will now hold them twice a week. The first session remains on Wednesday night, and the second will be on Friday during the fourth period in the morning. Friday morning? Harry exclaimed, surprised. But we have potions class during the third and fourth periods on Friday. Indeed, Professor Blaine replied cheerfully. However, after some persuasion, Professor Snape has agreed to give me the time for the fourth period. But don't celebrate just yet, Mr. Potter. If you fall behind in potions due to the reduced class time, you'll have to receive one-on-one tutoring from Professor Snape. I'm doomed, Neville muttered, his expression of despair prompting laughter from the others. Now, for the second announcement, Professor Blaine continued, once the room had quieted. Last semester, I was unable to participate in the latter part of this course's training. However, I've been informed by Miss Granger about your progress. To be honest, I'm not entirely satisfied. Despite his calm and gentle demeanor, Professor Blaine's words made everyone tense. Previously, we completed some basic training. I believe you've all begun to understand its importance, correct? Harry and Hermione nodded vigorously, joined by more voices than expected. Hopkins from Hufflepuff spoke up excitedly. Over the summer, I dueled with my dad. I used to last only a few minutes, but this time he was exhausted, and none of his spells hit me. That's precisely the goal of this training, Professor Blaine said, glancing appreciatively at Hopkins. It's about enhancing your physical abilities and reaction speed. You've made progress, but the results of... My course encompasses much more than what we've covered so far. My goal is to teach you how to win a duel, not just how to hide quickly. Therefore, we are about to enter a new phase of training. However, it's important that you continue practicing what you've learned previously. In each class, I will allocate time for you to train, and this classroom will remain open for you. Feel free to come by and practice whenever you wish. My expectation is that by the end of the school year, everyone will have mastered the basic reaction training. What are you going to teach us? Terry Butt inquired, raising his hand. For Ravenclaws, the pursuit of knowledge is always a priority. Professor Atticus Blaine gathered everyone into a semicircle in front of him. As he looked into their eager, curious eyes, a slight smile played on his lips. What I am about to teach you is the real deal. Dual magic. End of this chapter. Chapter 512, Dual Magic Classification. You are going to teach us the magic you used to defeat the Black Witch in the World Cup. After Professor Atticus Blaine announced with a faint smile that he intended to teach them magic, the already quiet classroom fell into an even deeper silence. The young wizards held their breath, eyes wide with disbelief, as if they couldn't trust their ears. Atticus Blaine was widely acknowledged as the most powerful wizard of the modern era. While many struggled to distinguish between most powerful and greatest, with Dumbledore being over 100 years old and the mysterious dark force vanquished by Harry Potter, Atticus Blaine stood as the most formidable figure in the wizarding world. Professor Blaine's declaration that he would teach them dueling magic was met with astonishment. Although many had hoped for this moment and anticipated its arrival during physical education classes, the reality of it left the young wizards in awe. As the realization sank in, Cedric Diggory of Hufflepuff couldn't contain his excitement. He had witnessed the duel of the century at this year's World Cup, and the memory of it still left him speechless. Why not be practical, Mr. Diggory? Professor Blaine chuckled. With a wave of his wand, additional desks and chairs appeared in the spacious classroom. Take your seats, everyone. Before we delve into magic, we need some theoretical training. The young wizards hurried to find seats. Hermione, missing out on the front row, slapped her leg in frustration. She then realized she hadn't brought a notebook or pen, which only added to her anxiety. With a swish, the curtains closed automatically, shutting out the darkness outside. The suits of armor, which had been a source of countless mishaps for the young wizards, pulled torches from the walls and circled the room, illuminating it as brightly as day. First, let me clarify something, Professor Blaine began, standing before a blackboard held by two armors. There is no such thing as dual magic. The inherent power of magic can be applied in various situations. The term dual magic is merely a loose generalization. In duels and battles, magic can be broadly categorized into three types: offensive magic, defensive magic, and functional magic. At Hogwarts, there had never been a course solely dedicated to teaching dueling. The ancient art of dueling relied more on personal understanding or was owned through countless confrontations. Thus, no young wizard dared to be inattentive at this moment. Offensive magic is straightforward, isn't it? It's the type of spell that incapacitates your opponent in a duel. There are many forms of this magic, such as a suit of armor clanked into position 30 feet away, ready to face the magic cast by Professor Blaine. With a resounding boom, the armor was blown apart. Explosion, Professor Blaine explained with a smile to the awestruck students, then summoned another suit of armor. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh! Silver flashes sliced through the air, reducing the armor to pieces. Cutting, Professor Blaine stated succinctly. What followed was a revelation for the young wizards. They watched as Professor Blaine demonstrated various destructive spells on the armors: burning, piercing, corroding, twisting, petrifying, disarming, and binding. He even used a spell to create intense gravity on the sturdy armor, crushing it into a flat disc. There are so many peculiar spells that I can't cover them all in detail, he concluded, leaving the students eager for more. In essence, my goal is singular: to render your opponent incapable of resistance, Professor Atticus Blaine declared, standing amidst a heap of scrap metal, his breathing steady and untroubled. It wasn't until the relentless barrage of attacks ceased that Harry felt his own breath ease, a sentiment shared by the young wizards surrounding him. For a brief moment, the sound of collective exhalation filled the classroom. "Do you expect us to learn all of this, Professor Blaine?" asked Katie Bell, a fifth-year Gryffindor and Harry's teammate, her cheeks flushed as she caught her breath. "With all due respect, that seems rather unlikely." "Absolutely impossible," Fred Weasley chimed in decisively, his words echoed by a chorus of agreement. Professor Blaine, unfazed, blew on his smoking wand and replied calmly, "What I want you to understand is that in a duel, a spell that can incapacitate your opponent is invaluable. You must have an offensive spell that you excel at. The specific spell doesn't matter." Harry's mind immediately went to the disarming charm, a spell he had seen Snape use in Professor Lockhart's dueling class. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, he had a knack for it, mastering it with ease after just one demonstration. "Now, let's discuss defensive magic," Professor Blaine continued, his gaze commanding the attention of the restless young wizards. "You've learned some dodging techniques, and under my guidance, you'll each master your own offensive spells. However, you must understand that dodging alone won't suffice. Your physical stamina has limits, and your dodging speed won't always outpace your opponent's attacks. An experienced wizard can predict your movements. You may have heard that attack is the best defense, but in a closely matched duel, maintaining an offensive stance is unsustainable. First, your magical energy will deplete. Second, every attack has a rhythm. If your opponent discerns this rhythm and finds an opening, your attack will falter, forcing you into a defensive stance. At that point, you'll need defensive magic. There's nothing to demonstrate now, but I will teach you in due course." No professor had ever managed to keep so many students so focused, yet Professor Blaine had achieved just that. Over 30 young wizards from the academy, ranging from third-year students to sixth-year Cedric Diggory, were captivated. They were learning from the most formidable wizard of their time, gaining systematic dueling experience, a priceless opportunity. Functional magic, or auxiliary magic, is the most challenging because it tests your combat awareness and comprehensive magical knowledge. It's difficult to fully describe, but I can provide an example. "So, Miss Granger," Professor Blaine suddenly called out. Hermione, deeply engrossed in Professor Blaine's teachings, was caught off guard. She stood up too quickly, her knee colliding painfully with the underside of the table. Despite the pain etched on her face, even Slytherin's Pansy Parkinson was too engrossed in Professor Blaine's lesson to laugh. "If, during a duel, I use magic to transform the ground beneath your feet into a swamp, do you understand? This isn't a direct attack, but it poses a significant problem by depriving you of space to dodge. Now, how would you address this issue? A skilled wizard could simply break the spell and restore the ground, but what if you lack that ability? Such ability. Tell me, In this situation, what magic would you use to extricate yourself from an embarrassing predicament? Professor Blaine inquired, his gaze sweeping across the room. Hermione furrowed her brow, deep in thought, while the other young wizards pondered the question as well. I can, Hermione said, pursing her lips as she mentally reviewed all the spells she had mastered over the years. Perhaps I would use a freezing spell to solidify the swamp, allowing people to stand on it again. Very well. 5 points to Gryffindor. Please take your seat, Miss Granger. Professor Blaine commended her. Hermione returned to her seat, beaming with joy, while Neville looked at her with admiration. The only solution he could think of was to dive into the mud, hoping his opponent wouldn't see him clearly. I believe you understand my point now, don't you? Professor Blaine addressed the captivated young wizards. Auxiliary spells may not directly attack, but they can create obstacles for your opponent in a duel and help you escape trouble. They can have unexpected effects. For instance, if you are facing a ferocious fire dragon, you obviously can now to defeat it outright. However, you can use a no-fly spell to prevent it from taking flight, a flame-extinguishing spell to silence it, and then blind its eyes. This approach would make the situation much more manageable. Of course, this type of magic covers many aspects. In this class, I will only introduce you to the concept of using functional spells creatively. For specific spell learning, you must continue to take your spell classes seriously. Chapter 513. The Spiritual World. The room was enveloped in silence as Atticus Blaine stood before the eager young wizards, their faces flushed with excitement. Every young wizard harbored dreams of one day becoming as powerful as Professor Dumbledore or Professor Blaine. Yet for this group, the path to such power seemed obscured by the complex and tedious knowledge taught in the remaining courses at Hogwarts. However, the knowledge and magic that Professor Blaine had just shared with them sparked a glimmer of hope. Professor Blaine, Cedric from Hufflepuff spoke up, his eyes gleaming in the candlelight. If we can keep up with your teachings, does that mean we might have a chance to become champions of Hogwarts and win the Triwizard Tournament for the school? His voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if he dared not hope too much. Cedric's question sent a ripple of anticipation through the room. Harry and Draco, among others, felt a thrill of excitement. If Ron knew what he was missing, he would regret it deeply. Harry and Hermione exchanged a glance, each reading the other's thoughts. Harry, in particular, felt a pang of regret for Ron's decision to drop the course, a regret that now reached its peak. I'm afraid not, Mr. Diggory, Professor Blaine replied, dashing their hopes. The Triwizard Tournament is not merely a duel competition. It tests how young wizards use magic to navigate unexpected crises. It requires a comprehensive set of skills, magic, adaptability, and wisdom. If brute force could solve all challenges, the event would be reduced to a mere duel. Cedric nodded thoughtfully, unaware of Cho Chang's gaze from behind him, her eyes shimmering with interest. Please remember what I just told you, Professor Blaine continued. When you return, each of you will write a paper, no less than 12 inches long, discussing your understanding of the memory of duels. Submit it to me by next Wednesday night. Despite the assignment, no one complained. These young wizards, though sometimes mischievous, were not foolish. They recognized the rarity of such an opportunity. Now, we are about to begin the formal offensive spell teaching course, Professor Blaine announced solemnly. I must remind everyone that from today, those participating in this course are strictly prohibited from using magic wands in conflicts at school, even if both parties are students of this course. Violating this rule will result in the most severe punishment. The little wizards were visibly intimidated by Professor Blaine's stern warning. They understood that the consequences could be as severe as expulsion from the course or even from Hogwarts itself. But we need actual combat practice, don't we, Professor Blaine? Theodore Knott from Slytherin asked, his tone flat. We can't become masters of duels without real experience. I will provide opportunities for practice, Professor Blaine assured him, casting an approving glance at Theodore. But first, you must build a solid foundation. Draco glanced at Harry from across the room, his expression tinged with regret. Where do we begin, Professor Blaine? Hermione asked eagerly, her cheeks flushed and her breath quickening with anticipation. Blaine, what is happening? Harry asked, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness. The students, bewildered and slightly frightened, gathered around Harry and Hermione, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The pure white expanse stretched endlessly in every direction, devoid of any landmarks or features. It was as if they had been transported to a realm beyond their understanding. "Stay calm, everyone," Hermione urged, trying to steady her own racing heart. "There must be a reason for this." Just then, a soft, resonant voice filled the air, seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Welcome, young wizards, to the realm of possibilities," Professor Blaine's voice intoned, soothing yet commanding. "This is a place where the boundaries of magic and reality blur, where your potential can be truly explored." The students exchanged glances, their initial fear giving way to curiosity. Professor Blaine's presence, though unseen, was reassuring. They knew he was guiding them through this extraordinary experience. "Why are we here, Professor?" Hermione called out, her voice steady despite the uncertainty. "This is a lesson unlike any other," Professor Blaine replied. "Here, you will learn not from books or lectures, but from the depths of your own imagination and the strength of your will. Magic is not just about spells and incantations. It is about understanding the essence of what you can achieve." As he spoke, the white expanse began to shift and change. Colors swirled and danced, forming shapes and patterns that defied logic. The students watched in awe as the world around them transformed, each of them seeing something different, something personal. Harry saw a vast Quidditch field, the stands filled with cheering fans. Hermione envisioned a grand library, its shelves stretching into infinity, filled with books of untold knowledge. Each student experienced their own unique vision, a reflection of their deepest desires and dreams. "Embrace what you see," Professor Blaine encouraged. "Let it guide you, challenge you, and inspire you. This is the true power of magic." Slowly, the students began to explore their surroundings, their initial trepidation replaced by a sense of wonder and excitement. They realized that this was not just a lesson in magic, but a journey of self-discovery. As they ventured further into their individual visions, they understood that Professor Blaine had given them a gift far greater than any textbook could provide. He had opened their minds to the limitless possibilities of magic and the boundless potential within themselves. And so, in that realm of possibilities, the young wizards of Hogwarts embarked on a journey that would forever change their understanding of magic and their place in the world. "Atticus Blaine took us out of Hogwarts?" Ginny whispered, disbelief evident in her voice. "Impossible." Despite her own doubts, Hermione instinctively countered. "If you've read Hogwarts: A History, you'd know the school is protected by powerful magic that prevents all forms of teleportation. But that's Professor Blaine, isn't it?" Neville interjected, his voice trembling. "He could do anything." Hermione, unwilling to waste time arguing with Neville's naive perspective, focused on trying to understand their current location, just like all the other young wizards around her. "Welcome." A familiar, steady voice suddenly resonated in their ears. The young wizards quickly turned toward the source of the sound. There, emerging from a swirling distortion in the air, stood Professor Atticus Blaine. His deep-set eyes and enigmatic smile were unmistakable. The ground seemed to shift beneath him as the hazy air parted, revealing his outstretched arms. "Welcome to my spiritual world," he announced, his voice both inviting and mysterious. End of this chapter. Chapter 514, A Wonderful Way. "The spiritual world of Professor Blaine," Harry murmured, glancing at Hermione with confusion. To his surprise, Hermione, who usually had all the answers, looked just as puzzled. Harry assumed that the spiritual world was a type of magic only senior students could access, so he turned his attention to Cedric Diggory. However, Cedric's equally bewildered expression told Harry that he was no more informed than the rest of them. Professor Atticus Blaine observed the anxious young wizards with a slight smile. "Perhaps you're still confused. Allow me to explain," he began, placing his hands behind his back as he admired the flawless white world around them. "This world is not real. It is an artificial realm I created, a world that only thoughts can enter. I have extracted your thoughts, materialized them, and placed them into this world. Meanwhile, your physical bodies remain in the physical education classroom." The young wizards stood with mouths slightly agape, struggling to fully grasp Professor Blaine's explanation. However, they understood one thing. The place they were in was a magical creation of Professor Blaine. Creating a world with magic, Hermione murmured, feeling an overwhelming urge to cry. Her extensive knowledge of magic seemed to crumble at the thought of such a feat, and she couldn't fathom what kind of magic could accomplish this. False thoughts, Harry muttered, looking down at his hands. He repeatedly clenched and unclenched his fists, disbelief etched on his face. The vivid sensation made it hard for him to accept that he was, in fact, not real. But why did you bring us into this world? You created it. Aren't we supposed to be learning magic from you, Professor Blaine? Asked a second-year Slytherin witch from the Greengrass family, one of the 28 sacred pure-blood clans. Astoria, the only first-year student invited to join the physical education class, inquired in a delicate voice, "Could it be that learning magic in this world offers us some advantage?" "An excellent guess, Miss Greengrass," Professor Blaine replied, acknowledging Astoria with a nod before addressing the group. "You are all students who have been exposed to magic spells for some time. You must understand the challenges of learning a new spell, time being the most precious. Mastery requires repetition and practice. Outside, with only 2 classes a week, achieving the progress I expect would be difficult. However, here, in the spiritual world, time can theoretically be accelerated. A few hours here might equate to only a few minutes outside." Theodore Knott clenched his fist within his sleeve, looking at Professor Blaine with newfound respect. The Knott family, known for their mastery of ancient magic, understood the complexities of manipulating time. They were the only family in the magical world with the knowledge to create time-turners, though they had surrendered all of them to the Ministry of Magic, claiming the art was lost. Theodore, aware of the formidable nature of time magic, was astounded by Professor Blaine's ability to manipulate time in this way. "Of course, I must caution you," Professor Blaine continued, meeting Hermione's eager gaze with a serious expression. "The acceleration of time is due to your thoughts moving faster, which has significant side effects and can place a great burden on your body. Therefore, do not become addicted to the allure of having more time." Hermione mumbled in disappointment, but understood the warning. She had used a time-turner before, and the experience had taught her the importance of respecting the boundaries of time manipulation. Atticus Blaine had warned that attempting to buy more time for study through magical means could have dire consequences. Indeed, as Professor Blaine had mentioned, it would place a tremendous burden on the body. "There are some benefits to learning magic in the spiritual world," Professor Blaine began, dispelling any unrealistic illusions. "I believe that most students in Professor Flitwick's Charms class have experience at this, knowing the incantation and the wand movements for a spell, yet still being unable to master it." Neville nodded vigorously, clearly concerned. "That's because the success of a spell depends not only on the incantation and gestures, but also on other subtle factors," Professor Blaine continued. "For instance, the stability of the magic within you, drawn by the spell, and the concentration of your spirit. These fluctuations in power are difficult to teach in class and can only be adjusted through repeated practice. However, in the spiritual world, these issues become more intuitive." Professor Blaine glanced at the attentive young wizards, then turned and drew out his wand. As he waved it, magnificent 3-dimensional structures, glowing with splendor, emerged from its tip. These structures varied in complexity, from a few simple lines to intricate designs with dozens of lines. Each mysterious form floated in the air, spinning and emitting inexplicable fluctuations. Harry stared at the various shapes, wide-eyed. Though he couldn't fully comprehend them, he sensed an indescribable beauty. If he had to describe it, Harry thought it was the beauty of magic itself. "Magic configuration!" Hermione exclaimed, covering her mouth in surprise. Professor Blaine chuckled. "Ah, you recognize it, Miss Granger. Indeed, in the first lesson of Professor Flitwick's Charms class, he introduces the core of spellcasting, the configuration of magic. Beyond that, he doesn't elaborate much, as this knowledge is quite esoteric and often deemed unnecessary. However, if you wish to improve a spell or invent a new one, understanding this is essential." "I don't understand, Professor Blaine. Astoria said earnestly. Our goal is to learn offensive magic, not to invent or improve spells, right? Don't worry, Miss Greengrass, Professor Blaine reassured her. Summoning the young wizards into the constructed spiritual world and ensuring they didn't think too quickly to avoid physical collapse was a challenge for Atticus. After rubbing his tired eyes, he continued, practicing spells here won't produce effects, but it will reveal the magic configuration of the spell. This helps you see where your problems lie. Different mistakes will lead to different issues in the magic configuration you create, meaning with simple guidance, you can learn how to adjust your spellcasting. Seeing the group of puzzled young wizards, Professor Blaine spoke calmly. Don't worry, once you try it, you'll understand. The disarming spell, the stunning spell, the petrification spell, and the obstacle spell. These are simple spells you must master. Professor Blaine raised his head and, with a flick of his fingers, the previous configurations emitting strange fluctuations dissipated. 4 configurations, each composed of about a dozen magical pathways, floated before the young wizards. What I require of you is to cast these basic spells silently. Silent casting? Harry whispered to Hermione, leaning closer. What does that mean? It's very difficult to cast a spell successfully without speaking the incantation, Hermione replied softly. Chanting a spell silently is a rare skill, even among adult wizards, Hermione remarked, casting a glance at Professor Atticus Blaine. He appeared to be merely advising them on proper table manners, like not making chewing noises while eating. She instinctively wiped her temples, only to remember that they were in an illusory image within the spiritual world constructed by Professor Blaine, where sweating was impossible. Silent spellcasting is a skill typically introduced at the newt level. Among the young wizards present, only a handful had been exposed to this knowledge, and none had yet mastered it. Professor Blaine's expectations weighed heavily on the students, yet no one voiced any concerns. By this stage in their education, the importance of the course was self-evident. Let's begin practicing, Professor Blaine announced with a smile, clapping his hands together. I trust you've encountered one or more of these spells before. First, grasp this learning method, and then we'll move on to the next steps. End of this chapter. Chapter 5:15. Although Professor Blaine had instructed them to begin practicing, no one moved. The young wizards gazed at him with eager eyes, unsure of how to proceed. Observing their hesitation, Atticus Blaine shook his head in mild exasperation. His gaze swept the room and settled on Cedric Diggory, the oldest among them. After a moment's thought, he beckoned to Diggory. Come up, Mr. Diggory. Come to me. Cedric Diggory was tall and slender, nearly matching Professor Blaine in height. Yet, standing before the professor, he seemed to shrink, his head bowing slightly as if he were suddenly shorter. Tell me, Mr. Diggory, how many of the spells I mentioned, disarming, stunning, petrification, and obstacle, are you familiar with? Cedric, a 6th-year student, had encountered these spells in his charms and defense against the dark arts classes and had a good grasp of them. However, he was unsure of Professor Blaine's intentions, so he replied honestly, I can do it, Professor. Hermione raised an eyebrow. These spells were not particularly challenging, and she had already mastered them. Very good, Professor Blaine nodded, and with a flick of his fingers, the 4 magical configurations spread out, each 50 feet apart, with one hovering behind him. He stepped aside, revealing the red prism in front of Cedric. This is the magical configuration of a standard stunning spell. Mr. Diggory, stand in front and use the stunning spell on it. Atticus folded his arms, his lavender eyes gleaming with interest. Let me see how well you master the stunning spell. Though still puzzled, Cedric complied, retrieving his wand from his pocket. He paused momentarily, recalling that Professor Blaine had mentioned their current forms were merely manifestations of thought. Why, then, was his wand still with him? But now was not the time to ponder such mysteries. Glancing back at his classmates, who were watching intently, Cedric took a deep breath to steady his nerves and wiped imaginary sweat from his palms onto his robe. His resolve hardened. Stupefy! Cedric's wrist flicked swiftly, and he lunged forward. Yet, instead of the anticipated red light, a miniature prism of red light appeared at the tip of his wand, mirroring the structure of Professor Blaine's stunning spell. The magic configuration Cedric conjured was swiftly drawn to Professor Blaine's configuration, merging with it and causing a structural tremor. Cedric turned to Professor Blaine with an innocent expression. At that moment, the trembling ceased, and Professor Blaine's cold, emotionless voice resonated. Stunning spell, magic power configuration completion, 81%. Spell judgment, valid, defect, magic power supply deviating from range, casting gesture deviation, 7%. A collective gasp echoed through the illusory spiritual world. Cedric Diggory, standing so close, was utterly bewildered. He stared blankly at the standard magic configuration that was evaluating his spell from every angle, his mind in turmoil. But it wasn't over. After the systematic evaluation, the magic configuration emitted a puff of smoke. Under astonished gazes, the smoke coalesced into a hand holding a wand, demonstrating the standard casting motion of the stunning spell. "Understand?" Atticus asked, turning slightly to look at Cedric. Cedric, the captain of the Hufflepuff Quidditch team and admired by many young witches for his handsome looks, was transfixed by the demonstration. Too shocked to speak, he simply nodded in silent acknowledgement. How on earth did he come to this? Discussions erupted suddenly. The young wizards gazed at Professor Atticus Blaine with admiration, their eyes filled with fervor. "Professor Blaine has infused his thoughts into the magical configuration," Hermione exclaimed, her fingertips trembling with excitement as she clutched Harry's arm. "Look, Harry, it's just like the Sorting Hat." This was an incredibly fitting analogy. The young wizards who heard Hermione's words suddenly realized that the Sorting Hat was imbued with the thoughts of the Hogwarts founders, all owing it to peer into their hearts and assign them to the most suitable house. The magical configuration before them operated on the same principle. At that moment, Professor Blaine's stature among the young wizards soared, nearing the legendary status of the 4 founding giants of Hogwarts. However, Professor Blaine seemed uncomfortable with the adulation. He frowned slightly and addressed the class. "I'm not here to create a cult of personality. If you understand the concept, then let's proceed. Choose the magic you wish to practice, line up, and after receiving feedback, find a place to practice and correct your mistakes. Once you're confident there are no issues, you can have it rechecked. To achieve silent casting, your proficiency in the spell must exceed 95%. The enthusiasm of the young wizards was overwhelming. 30 students rushed to the 4 magical configurations, eager to test their skills. The chaos that ensued forced Atticus to establish some rules to manage the disorderly behavior. Harry, without hesitation, chose the disarming charm, eager to assess his mastery of the spell. Hermione, determined to compete with Cedric Diggory, headed for the stunning charm. Neville initially aimed for the petrification curse, as it was the only spell he had mastered, but he was too slow. With many already gathered there, he reluctantly followed Hermione. "Stupefy!" Hermione shouted confidently. Her spell was absorbed by the standard magical configuration, and Professor Blaine's voice echoed, "Stunning charm, magic configuration completion, 92%, spell judgment, effective, defects, negative deviation in magic supply, casting gesture deviation 3%. Suggestions: 1. Strengthen attack intent during casting. 2. Practice repeatedly." A smile of satisfaction crossed Hermione's face, and she pondered the suggestions as she walked away thoughtfully. Neville swallowed hard, raising his wand with trembling hands. "Stupefy," he attempted, but his wand shook, producing a strange structure. After a buzzing sound, an oppressive silence followed. Suspected stunning charm, magic configuration completion, 17%, spell judgment invalid, defects negative deviation in magic supply, unstable magic supply, casting gesture deviation, 67%, suggestion, none. Draco Malfoy's laughter rang out, and Neville's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as he lowered his head and retreated. Professor Blaine noticed Neville's disappointment, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Suddenly, the pure white world shattered like glass. In the Hogwarts classroom, the young wizards awoke one by one, looking around in confusion. It took them a moment to realize where they were. Harry glanced at the gold watch on his wrist, a gift from Professor Blaine that he always wore. "It's only been about 6 minutes," he remarked incredulously to Hermione. They had practiced for what felt like 2 or 3 hours in the spiritual world, yet only a few minutes had passed in reality. Professor Atticus Blaine had already emphasized this point, Yet Harry still found it hard to believe. Professor Blaine stood before them, gently massaging his temples, looking somewhat weary. Harry rose from his seat, intending to check on the situation, but as soon as he stood, the world seemed to spin around him. A wave of dizziness overwhelmed his senses, and he immediately collapsed back onto the bench. "Careful, Mr. Potter," Professor Blaine remarked with a gentle smile, having noticed Harry's predicament. "Although time has been compressed, the fatigue you feel in the spiritual realm is very real. Everyone, please remain seated and refrain from moving too hastily. You have 10 minutes to rest." Professor Blaine took a deep breath, surveying the group of dizzy young wizards. "In the next hour, we'll be practicing dodging dung eggs and moving our bodies," he announced. End of this chapter. Chapter 516. Envy. At 9 p.m., Hogwarts Castle lay bathed in the pure glow of starlight, enveloped in a serene silence. The absence of clanking armor, much of which Professor Blaine had requisitioned for his own purposes, contributed to the castle's newfound tranquility. Only the portraits on the walls whispered softly to the young wizards returning late to their dormitories. In the entrance hall, the students of the four houses parted ways. Slytherin and Hufflepuff descended towards the basement, while Ravenclaw and Gryffindor ascended to their respective towers. "Oh, that's—" Harry began, eager to share the night's events with Ron. As he hurried up the spiral staircase, his eyes caught sight of a limping figure patrolling the castle's edge. The figure had just emerged from the shadows near Hagrid's hut, momentarily illuminated before disappearing into the darkness. "It's Professor Moody," Harry remarked with mild surprise. "Do you think he patrols the campus every night on Professor Dumbledore's orders?" "Not necessarily," Fred chimed in enthusiastically. "You know he used to be an Auror. Dad says he's incredibly vigilant. He probably thinks Hogwarts is as dangerous as Azkaban." "But surely no one could sneak into Hogwarts unnoticed, right?" Hermione countered skeptically. "Not always," Harry grinned. "Remember, Sirius managed it, and Peter Pettigrew hid here for over 2 years before anyone realized." The mention of Peter Pettigrew sent a shiver through the Weasley siblings. The treacherous animagus had not only lurked at Hogwarts, but had also lived with them for 12 years. Whenever the topic arose at home, Mr. Weasley would turn pale, and Mrs. Weasley would struggle to catch her breath. "Why doesn't he use a lamp?" Ginny wondered aloud. "Even the darkness can't deceive his eyes," Fred said with a touch of admiration. "Aside from Professor Blaine, Moody's the most promising defense against the dark arts professor we've had in years." "He's so cool," George added. Harry wasn't entirely convinced. He held a special fondness for Remus and Sirius, but Hermione's curiosity was piqued. "What happened?" "Absolutely wonderful," Fred and George exchanged knowing glances. Fred, now standing on a corner platform, turned to Hermione with a raised eyebrow. "He's a true master of combating dark magic." "We have his class tomorrow," Harry suddenly remembered, his excitement growing. "Is Professor Moody's class more interesting than Professor Blaine's PE class?" Before tonight, Harry would have described Professor Blaine's PE class as useful rather than interesting. "They're two different things, Harry," George said, shaking his head. "Professor Blaine mentioned he'd review Professor Moody's curriculum. If it doesn't meet the standards, he might expel Moody from Hogwarts. He's probably been preparing for this in the past few days. Maybe tomorrow he'll be in the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom." Ginny interjected coolly. "When did this happen?" Fred and George asked, astonished by their sister's knowledge. "On the first day of school after their duel in the hall," Ginny replied, glancing at Harry. "I was hiding behind a pillar outside the door. Professor McGonagall didn't see me, but I overheard their conversation. No one wanted to see Professor Moody leave. After all, he was invited by Professor Dumbledore and was a good friend of Mr. Weasley." Harry felt a pang of guilt, recalling how Moody had defended him against Malfoy's sneak attack. If Moody were expelled, Atticus Blaine had expelled Harry from Hogwarts, and this weighed heavily on Harry's conscience. He felt a sense of guilt, though he believed Malfoy shared some of the blame. With these thoughts swirling in his mind, Harry returned to the Gryffindor common room. The recent festivities had drained the energy of most students. Although it was still early for the usually lively Gryffindor wizards, the common room was now empty, save for the cozy chairs and sofas. The only sound was the occasional crackle from the smoldering flames in the Fanfiction replace. After the evening's class, even the diligent Hermione was too exhausted to study. She picked up Crookshanks, who had emerged from under the sofa, waved to Harry, and headed towards the girls' dormitory with the cat in her arms. After bidding farewell to Fred and George, Harry and Neville made their way back to their dormitory. As expected, Ron and the others were still awake. Ron, Seamus, and Dean were seated on soft cushions on the floor, engrossed in a game of chess. "Checkmate!" Ron exclaimed triumphantly as his knight leaped across the board, toppling Dean's king. Dean sighed in defeat. "Oh, you're back?" Ron said, looking up just as he was about to call Seamus for another round. He noticed Harry and Neville entering and, catching sight of their expressions, raised an eyebrow with a grin. "What's up? Did the smell of those dung bombs finally get to you? Didn't Professor Blaine mention to Hermione that there would be changes in the course?" Dean, who had just lost another game, stood up and asked curiously, "Did Professor Blaine increase the dung bombs?" "You missed something exciting," Neville interjected before Harry could respond, eager to share the news with the others. "Professor Blaine officially started teaching us dueling magic." "What?" Seamus and Dean exclaimed in unison. Seamus abandoned the chess pieces he'd been playing with all night, and along with Dean, grabbed Neville's arm. "Tell us everything, Neville." Neville eagerly recounted the details of the evening's class, from Professor Blaine's analysis of the 3 subdivisions of dueling magic to the incredible spells they had learned. Even Harry was surprised at how well Neville remembered everything, given his usual tendency to forget minor details. "So, Harry," Ron finally spoke, his cheeks puffed with surprise. He looked at Harry and asked softly, "Is it true? Is Professor Blaine really teaching you dueling magic?" Harry nodded, trying to downplay the situation. "Just some basic spells for dueling, Ron. You can learn them in Charms class too, but Professor Blaine has advanced our progress." "Learning magic in Professor Blaine's class," Seamus grumbled, retreating to his bed in frustration. "What did we miss?" "Do you think," Dean asked, tugging at his hair in regret, "Professor Blaine would accept our apology and let us back into the course?" Ron paused, then looked at Harry expectantly. Harry and Neville exchanged glances and fell silent. The chess pieces lay scattered on the blanket, forgotten. As the dormitory lights dimmed, a heavy silence filled the room. The usual bedtime chatter was absent, and the bright moonlight cast a somber glow over the sleeping quarters. The light filtering through the window did little to alleviate the pervasive sense of gloom. Atticus Blaine quietly lifted his head and glanced over at Ron's bed. Ron lay facing the wall, wrapped tightly in his quilt, as if he were asleep. But Atticus knew Ron well enough to recognize the pretense. Who could have foreseen that events would unfold in such a manner? Atticus, equally burdened with melancholy, let his head sink back onto the pillow, his eyes tracing the patterns of light and shadow dancing across the ceiling. Slowly, his thoughts dissolved into a haze of confusion. End of chapter. Chapter 517. Moody's Lesson. Fortunately, perhaps as a compensation for the dreary weather that plagued the days leading up to the start of school, the sky above Hogwarts Castle was clear and bright during the first week of classes. Today was no exception. The golden morning sunlight bathed the castle, casting a warm glow on everything it touched. Harry, who had enjoyed a restful night's sleep, awoke to this radiant morning. He rubbed his eyes, yawned, and sat up in bed, surprised to find the dormitory empty. Startled, he quickly fumbled for his glasses on the edge of his pillow. Once his vision cleared, he grabbed his watch and, upon seeing the time, relaxed his tense expression. After spending 10 minutes washing up and changing clothes, Harry retrieved the Dark Arts Self-Defense Guide from a pile of books and stuffed it into his bag. On a typical school morning, the common room was usually bustling, but today it was relatively quiet, with only a few students milling about. Harry didn't spot Neville or Seamus, so he assumed they were already having breakfast in the Great Hall. His assumption proved correct when he found his classmates gathered there. Hermione was present, deeply engrossed in an old book. Harry recognized it immediately. It was the same book on magical configurations that Professor Blaine had given her. "I saw you were sleeping soundly, so I didn't wake you," Ron called out with a grin as Harry entered the Great Hall from the foyer. Yeah, Harry replied, pulling out the chair next to Hermione and expertly stuffing a piece of lemon meringue pie into his mouth. I was really tired. Ron wiped his brow and joined the others in discussing Professor Blaine's dueling theory from class. Meanwhile, Harry scanned the auditorium. As expected, young wizards at nearly every long table were animatedly discussing their dueling courses. Even at the staff table, Professor McGonagall had called Angelina over to gather more information, and several other professors, including Professor Dumbledore, listened intently. Harry's gaze drifted to the Slytherin table, where Malfoy was animatedly recounting the events to Crabbe, Goyle, and other students who hadn't participated in the course. This sight stirred a wave of anger in Harry. If it weren't for Malfoy's meddling, Professor Blaine wouldn't have had to investigate Professor Moody, nor would there be any threat of Moody's departure. However, Harry's concern for Professor Moody was overshadowed by his worry for Ron. As he ate, he observed Ron closely, feeling increasingly uneasy about his friend's demeanor. "Hermione," Harry called softly. Hermione responded, her eyes still glued to her book, acknowledging him with a slight hum. "I think there's something wrong with Ron," Harry said, prompting Hermione to finally look up. She glanced at Ron a few times, then turned to Harry, her eyes expectant and patient. Harry lowered his voice, explaining the situation as succinctly as possible. "You didn't see it, Hermione," he whispered. "Last night, after Ron heard about the latest developments in the gym class, he looked so disappointed, just like last year, when he thought Scabbers had died at the hands of Rick Rukshan. But now, he seems to have completely forgotten about it, as if nothing happened." Hermione's expression remained calm, her pure brown eyes showing no surprise or concern. "Isn't that obvious?" she said, glancing at Ron again, who had turned his head away. "Ron is avoiding the issue. He's afraid we'll notice that he regrets giving up Professor Blaine's course. In fact, he's made it quite clear." Harry opened his mouth to respond, but Hermione's insight left him momentarily speechless. Opened his mouth to speak, he hesitated, unsure of what to say. He recalled Ron's embarrassed expression when Mr. Weasley praised the physical strength of Ron, Hermione, and the other Weasley children as they climbed Stoat Hill on their way from the burrow to the Quidditch field. Harry had to admit that Hermione was right. Ron was already showing signs of regret, but neither he nor Harry wanted to make it too obvious. "We have to help Ron, Hermione," Harry whispered after a long silence, breaking Hermione's concentration on the mysterious world of magical configurations. With a sharp snap, Hermione closed the book she was holding. Her eyes, now filled with a hint of anger, met Harry's. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as she clenched her teeth and asked, "What do you think we should do, Harry?" She gripped Professor Blaine's book so tightly that her fingertips turned white. "Ask Professor Blaine to let Ron back into the physical education class? If that's what you're thinking, save your breath, Harry. We all know what Professor Blaine is like. He's not as lenient as others and wouldn't tolerate Malfoy causing trouble in his class. Professor Blaine won't go back on his word." During the selection stage, he made it clear that anyone who dropped his course wouldn't get a second chance. "Do you really think it's possible to convince him to let Ron rejoin?" Harry wasn't the only one feeling regretful. Lavender had complained to Hermione in the dormitory the previous night, saying that Professor Blaine should have been more transparent about the teaching plan from the start. "As if she could dictate Professor Blaine's decisions," Hermione scoffed. "What are you talking about?" Ron suddenly turned to Hermione with a puzzled expression. "Why are you so upset, Hermione?" Without a word, Hermione stood up abruptly, grabbed her school bag, clutched Professor Blaine's book to her chest, and walked out of the hall without looking back. "Why is she acting so crazy this early in the morning?" Ron asked, frowning as he watched Hermione leave. It's about Professor Moody," Harry replied awkwardly. He recounted what Ginny had told him about Professor Blaine's investigation into Professor Moody. "Professor Moody upset Professor Blaine because he wanted to help us, so I asked Hermione if we could ask Professor Blaine for leniency." Harry improvised, but Hermione thinks, well, Professor Moody shouldn't have used magic to attack Malfoy. "Is she crazy?" Ron exclaimed in surprise. "Whose side is she on?" "Yeah," Harry mumbled, avoiding Ron's gaze and nodding awkwardly. The next time they saw Hermione was in Professor Moody's Defense Against the Dark Arts class. When Harry and Ron entered the classroom, it was nearly full. They quickly found seats near the back. Harry glanced around and spotted Professor Blaine sitting alone on a stool by the window, eyes closed as if asleep. Many students were puzzled by Professor Blaine's presence in the class, though a few knew the reason. As time passed, the classroom filled up, but perhaps due to Professor Blaine's presence, no one dared to make a sound. Everyone sat quietly, waiting for the class to begin. Harry wondered why Professor Moody hadn't appeared yet. Could he be avoiding the class to prevent embarrassment in front of Professor Blaine? The thought weighed heavily on Harry's mind. Draco Malfoy stood in front of Atticus Blaine, seemingly unharmed, which made Harry grit his teeth in frustration. Malfoy might have discovered the reason for Professor Blaine's presence here. He was staring expectantly at the classroom door, a smug look of glee on his face. Boom, boom, boom. The unmistakable sound of a cane striking the floor reached Harry's ears, and he breathed a sigh of relief. At least Professor Moody hadn't fled in alarm. As soon as Professor Moody entered, he noticed Professor Blaine sitting by the window. His steps faltered momentarily before he resumed his usual gait. With difficulty, he made his way to the podium, extracted the roster, shook his head, and brushed aside his long, gray hair, revealing his twisted, scarred face. The roll call began. His normal eye scanned the list, while his magical eye roved around, scrutinizing each student as they responded. However, Harry observed that the magical eye never once turned towards Professor Blaine, as if deliberately avoiding him. "All right," Professor Moody rasped after the last student answered. He returned the roster to the podium and continued in his gravelly voice, "I think you've all noticed we have a guest in this class." At that moment, Atticus Blaine, who had been sitting by the window with his eyes closed, opened them just in time. End of this chapter. Chapter 518, Irresistible. Professor Blaine is here to test me. He seems concerned that I might use magic to remove your legs during class. Professor Moody chuckled hoarsely. I must clarify, Professor Blaine. If you expect me to stick strictly to the textbook, I'm afraid that's not my style. As long as you don't actually remove the students' legs one by one, Professor Moody, Atticus Blaine replied with a smile, feel free to proceed at your own pace. Moody let out a series of snorts, a sound that was somewhere between a cough and a sneer. I received a letter from Professor Black detailing the curriculum. It seems you've already mastered the basics of handling dark magical creatures. Boggarts, redcaps, kappas, grindylows, and werewolves, correct? The students murmured their agreement. But your skills in handling spells are lacking, Moody continued. So I'm here to give you a taste of what real wizards face. I have a year to teach you how to defend against the dark arts. What? Ron exclaimed, suddenly animated. Are you going to teach us how to duel? His excitement was shared by many, who glanced at Professor Blaine to gauge his reaction. Yet Blaine remained calm, as if he hadn't heard a thing. The young wizards were aware that Professor Blaine had begun teaching dueling in his physical education classes, and Moody's claim seemed to challenge that. Red hair. Moody's magical eye swiveled to fix on Ron, who realized his outburst. It felt as if cold water had been poured over him, freezing him in place. You're Arthur Weasley's son, right? Moody's scarred face twisted into a peculiar smile. Your father helped me out of a tight spot recently. Harry suspected Moody was referring to something in the newspapers, but perhaps out of caution towards Professor Blaine, Moody didn't elaborate further. A duel? No, Mr. Weasley, it's something far more thrilling than a duel. It's about mind control, murder, torture. Dark magic often involves these elements. Moody stood at the podium, his fierce face turned towards the young wizards, his blue magical eye roving as if to intimidate them. This was his style, and it was precisely this approach that seemed to provoke Professor Blaine. Moody began his lesson on the 3 unforgivable curses, the Imperius Curse, the Cruciatus Curse, and the Avada Kedavra Curse. He asked the students to name these spells, which were strictly forbidden by the Ministry of Magic, and demonstrated them. Moody effortlessly captured the students' attention, drawing them into the dangerous allure of these spells. Even Harry momentarily forgot that Professor Blaine was present in the classroom. Watching the captivated students, a smile played on Atticus Blaine's lips. He recalled his own 5th year at Hogwarts, the first time he encountered the most dreaded of the unforgivable curses. He had been truly shocked then. The Avada Kedavra curse was indeed effective in taking lives. However, over the years, these spells had lost their taboo status in his eyes. After all, there were many spells capable of cruelly ending lives, and none were absolutely irresistible. "It's not pretty," Moody remarked. After a flash of dazzling green light, the classroom plunged into a profound silence, as if the specter of death itself hovered above them, scythe in hand. Moody swept the dead spider off the podium with a calm demeanor and said, "It's very unpleasant, and there's no way to break the spell or resist it. As far as anyone knows, only one person has ever escaped this spell, and he is sitting in front of me right now." Moody's eyes locked onto Harry, who felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. He sensed the entire class turning to look at him. Harry fixed his gaze on the empty blackboard, as if he were speaking to it, though in truth, he saw nothing. "As I mentioned," Moody continued, withdrawing his gaze, "at one time, these spells were used to enforce cruel rule and caused significant trouble for the Ministry of Magic. Consequently, the Ministry classified them as unforgivable. Using any of them on a human is enough to warrant a lifetime sentence in Azkaban. This is what you must resist, and this is what I will teach you to resist. You need to be prepared, vigilant, and most importantly, always alert. Never let your guard down. Now, take out your quills and write this down." The classroom filled with the sound of rustling parchment as the young wizards diligently took notes. Moody's attention shifted to Atticus Blaine, who seemed to be melting in the sunlight streaming through the window. Moody took a swig from his flask before addressing him. "What do you think, Professor Blaine?" he asked, standing in front of Atticus with his hands resting on his crutches. His magical blue eye swiveled away, its pupil pointing inward. "Well, what?" Atticus, lost in thought, blinked in confusion. "My class!" Moody's cheeks and eyelids twitched with irritation, and he felt a sudden urge to cast a spell on Blaine. This man had claimed he wanted to observe the class, yet he seemed utterly distracted. "Oh, this," Atticus blinked again. "It's not bad, Professor Moody. Quite interesting, actually. The young wizards seem to be enjoying it. You've certainly earned your place at Hogwarts." Moody's breathing grew uneven, and the scars on his face seemed ready to burst. But Atticus's gaze fell on Neville, whose shoulders were still trembling. The boy had been terrified by the spider under the Cruciatus curse, and had yet to recover fully. "But I must point out," Atticus continued, "that there's no need to overemphasize the horror of the 3 unforgivable curses to young wizards. They are merely dark magic used more frequently during the time when the Dark Lord was active. In my opinion, these spells are simply, well, black magic with a low threshold. They aren't as terrifying as they seem. Moreover, they aren't absolutely irresistible." With a sudden clatter, Harry's quill slipped from his hand, smearing ink across his notebook. He paid no mind to the ruined notes, his attention riveted on Professor Blaine in shock. Not absolutely irresistible. Did that include Avada Kedavra? End of this chapter. Chapter 519. The Nature of the Unforgivable Curse. In the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, the young wizards paused, their quills hovering above parchment. Their eyes shifted from Professor Atticus Blaine, who stood by the window, to the podium where Professor Moody had just delivered a startling revelation. Professor Moody had demonstrated the 3 unforgivable curses, emphasizing why these dark magics were strictly forbidden. Yet, in a surprising twist, Professor Blaine offered a different perspective. Harry Potter couldn't help but wonder if Professor Blaine was challenging Professor Moody out of spite. However, upon reflection, he dismissed this notion. With Professor Blaine's esteemed status in the magical world, he had no need for such petty displays of authority. Instead, he boldly claimed that these infamous dark spells were not as terrifying as commonly believed, and could, in fact, be resisted. The students in the room were not novices to the magical world. Many, like Ron Weasley, hailed from wizarding families and had heard tales of these curses from their parents. The Imperious Curse, the Cruciatus Curse, and the Avada Kedavra Curse were universally feared. Moody, standing at the podium, fixed his gaze on Atticus Blaine. Rather than anger, a peculiar unreadable expression flickered in his normal eye. "Why don't you come up and share your opinion, Professor Blaine?" Moody suggested, his voice carrying an unexpected softness that caught Harry off guard. It wasn't the content of Moody's words that was strange, but the tone. Despite his usual gruffness, there was an uncharacteristic gentleness in his voice. Harry wasn't alone in his surprise. Many, including Professor Blaine, looked at Moody with astonishment. Realizing his slip, Moody quickly cleared his throat and barked. "These young wizards and I are eager to hear your thoughts, Atticus. I want to see what novel ideas you can present. Of course, even if ordinary wizards use unforgivable curses on you, they can't easily harm you. But these students aren't as capable as you, Atticus. They must remain vigilant." "Vigilance is indeed important," Professor Blaine replied, rising from his stool. He met the curious gazes of the students with a slight smile. "However, I don't want you to mystify certain magics excessively, as that only deepens your fears." Rather than taking the podium, Professor Blaine clasped his hands behind his back and paced slowly between the rows of seats, contemplating how best to convey his message. Finally, he stopped beside Harry's desk. "Setting aside the effects of a curse, I prefer to explore the origins of magic. The Imperious Curse, the Cruciatus Curse, and Avada Kedavra, the three unforgivable curses. First, you must understand the essence of these spells. How do they function?" Professor Blaine's tone was calm, lacking the gravity and intimidation that accompanied Professor Moody's lecture. He scanned the young faces, as if hoping for a response. But who could possibly know? From the furrow in Professor Moody's brow, Harry sensed the challenge in Professor Blaine's question. It was a provocation, a call for engagement, one that Hermione Granger, ever the eager student, would surely rise to meet. Even if she were in Professor Blaine's shoes, the question remained unanswered, lingering in the air with an eager anticipation for resolution. Harry felt an overwhelming urge to confront Professor Blaine, to demand the answer from him. His parents had perished under the Avada Kedavra curse, and if there was any way to resist it, understanding this might bring them some peace. Perhaps he finally realized that neither a group of fourth-year wizards nor a retired Auror could provide the answer he sought. Professor Blaine exhaled a sigh of disappointment and began to speak slowly. The three unforgivable curses, in terms of classification, can all be defined as spiritual magic. They target the heart or soul of life. That's essentially what it means. Facing the many curious faces, Professor Blaine resumed pacing with his hands clasped behind his back. "The following are my personal opinions and may not be entirely accurate. After all, it is illegal to study and discuss these three magics, but they are fundamentally correct. We all know that the body and soul constitute life, and there is an extremely mysterious and complex connection between them. Throughout history, whether Muggles or wizards, we have been studying this connection, but unfortunately, no one has yet unraveled it." Professor Blaine returned to the spot where he had been lecturing, standing under a beam of sunlight that filtered through the curtains. The bright light turned his soft gray hair to gold. The soul animates the body. It is the source of mental and spiritual power. The three unforgivables, three simple spells, are difficult to resist and heal because they attack not the body. Moody was likely the only person in the classroom who could grasp what Atticus was explaining. The rest of the young wizards appeared bewildered, and Professor Blaine noticed this. He paused and shifted his approach. "Let's discuss the Imperious Curse first." Atticus glanced at Draco, who wore an uneasy expression. This unfortunate young man had personally experienced the Imperious Curse, having been controlled by Peter Pettigrew for several months. The soul-stealing curse allows the caster to use magic as a medium to impose their will on the mind of the cursed person. Have you noticed, everyone? There are two key elements here: magic power and thought, Professor Blaine explained in a clear tone. Among the three unforgivable curses, the Imperious Curse causes the least harm to the victim because it affects the most superficial thoughts, moving gradually from the mind to the heart to the soul. From the two key points I just mentioned, you can deduce two things. First, there are risks in using the Imperious Curse to control creatures with stronger magic than you. Second, using this magic to control creatures with stronger thoughts than you also poses a risk. Even if the cursed person does not use any magic to resist your control, they may still break free. This time, most of the students began to understand. Draco pursed his lips, his expression sour. According to Professor Blaine, his magic and thoughts had been completely overpowered by the despicable Peter Pettigrew. Additionally, regarding the Imperious Curse, Atticus continued calmly, on a certain level, it is actually quite easy to identify wizards controlled by the Imperious Curse. If you use the Imperious Curse on someone, it means that your thoughts and magic power must enter that person's body. A wizard with keen perception can easily detect this. Atticus Blaine. As soon as Atticus finished speaking, Hannah Abbott eagerly raised her hand. If I understand correctly, she asked with curiosity, is there a type of magic that can help people resist the control of the Imperious Curse? Indeed, there is, Professor Blaine replied with a smile and a nod. There exists an ancient magical skill capable of resisting all mind control spells. However, it requires a certain level of talent to master. We will discuss this in more detail later. For now, let's turn our attention to the Cruciatus Curse. At the mention of this particular magic, Neville, who had just managed to regain his composure, turned pale once more. This chapter concludes with a tribute to the greatest wizard of our time, Headmaster Michael Gambon. Chapter 520, Neville's Dilemma. Due to the relentless training in physical education class, Neville appeared far more capable than he had in the first half of the 3rd grade. His cheeks had thinned, and his body had become more robust, yet his eyes often betrayed a lingering confusion, a light that suggested he was still somewhat naive. Just like now, he was staring at Professor Blaine with a vacant expression, his pale lips murmuring softly. The Cruciatus Curse, you all witnessed Professor Moody's demonstration, Professor Blaine stated calmly. In simple terms, this spell inflicts pain, extreme pain, which cannot be overcome by sheer willpower. Does anyone know why? Harry anticipated another stretch of silence, or perhaps Hermione raising her hand to answer. To his surprise, Neville raised his hand unsteadily, a gesture that shocked even Professor Blaine. The entire class was taken aback. Professor Blaine raised his eyebrows, taking a moment to respond. Mr. Longbottom, please share your thoughts. You just said, Neville gasped as if his throat were constricted. Ignoring the sarcastic and surprised glances, he shrugged slightly. Think, heart, soul. The Imperious Curse controls thoughts, and the Cruciatus Curse, I believe, attacks the soul. Very well, Mr. Longbottom. 5 points to Gryffindor. Professor Blaine nodded appreciatively at Neville, awarding him extra points. Typically, outside of Professor Sprout's class, Neville wouldn't receive praise or extra points more than once a school year. Yet Neville didn't seem particularly joyful. His eyes remained fixed on Professor Blaine's face, anticipation and fear swirling in his gaze. As I mentioned earlier, the 3 unforgivable curses are all forms of spiritual black magic. The pain caused by the Cruciatus Curse isn't physical. It bypasses the mind's defenses and directly assaults the soul, making it impossible to resist through willpower alone. Perhaps due to Professor Blaine's calm demeanor, the young wizards became more composed. They seemed to forget they were dealing with the unforgivable curses, feared by the Ministry of Magic, treating them instead as mere spells in a charms class. Of course, there were exceptions. Neville and Harry. Both watched Professor Blaine with a mix of anticipation and fear as he paced the classroom. Because the Cruciatus Curse's damage strikes closer to the core, the trauma it inflicts is harder to heal. Miss Abbott? Hufflepuff's Hannah Abbott raised her hand, her 2 golden braids swaying nervously. You mentioned we shouldn't be too afraid of them, the unforgivable curses, but the knowledge you shared seems to confirm that we can't resist them, she said, her voice tinged with panic. Ernie, sitting next to Hannah, nodded in agreement, but quickly shook his head when he noticed Professor Blaine's gaze upon them. If I were to use transfiguration to turn your school bag into a knife and strike you on the neck, do you think you could resist it, Miss Abbott? Professor Blaine asked calmly. Of course not, Hannah exclaimed, feeling as if a cold blade were indeed pressed against her neck. She shuddered and quickly refocused on the discussion. Across the room, Hermione nodded thoughtfully. So, do you understand? Professor Blaine continued. Many forms of black magic and offensive spells, once they hit you, leave you with no chance of healing or resistance. From this perspective, at least the soul-stealing curse and the Cruciatus Curse. A curse won't finish you off immediately. In fact, even after being attacked, there's still a chance to make a comeback and be cured. Neville and Hannah sat closely together, and Atticus Blaine immediately noticed Neville's tense expression. "What's the matter, Mr. Longbottom?" Atticus inquired. Neville's eyes darted away, unable to meet Professor Blaine's gaze. He lowered his head, staring at the Defense Against the Dark Arts guide spread out on the table, hesitating. "Neville," Hermione prompted worriedly, "Professor Blaine is speaking to you." Her reminder was heard by many, but Neville remained unresponsive. His fists, hidden beneath the table, were clenched tightly, and his body trembled slightly. Harry, who had been anticipating the discussion of the last of the 3 unforgivable curses, looked at Neville in shock, puzzled by his behavior. "Perhaps," Professor Blaine began, but Professor Moody, who had been silent on the podium, interjected thoughtfully. "Mr. Longbottom might be wondering if there's any possibility of healing for wizards injured by the Cruciatus Curse." Neville's head shot up, his eyes wide with horror as he stared at Professor Moody, who returned his gaze with a knowing smile. "Is that so?" Atticus, observing the exchange, nodded thoughtfully. He was aware that Neville Longbottom's relatives had been tortured by the Cruciatus Curse and had yet to recover. Looking at Neville, who appeared as pale as frost, Atticus's expression darkened. "It depends on the situation," he said after a moment of contemplation. "The extent of the damage is crucial. If the caster's magic is mediocre and their intent isn't deeply malicious, in other words, if the Cruciatus Curse isn't particularly strong, St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries might be able to help the victim recover gradually." It was clear that this wasn't the answer Neville sought. "What if the Cruciatus Curse is exceptionally powerful?" Professor Moody asked, glancing at Hermione. She had been the first to notice Neville's distress when the Cruciatus Curse was demonstrated on spiders and had tried to intervene. Now, she watched Neville with concern. "That would be more complicated," Professor Blaine replied, shifting his gaze from Neville. "As I mentioned, the Cruciatus Curse attacks the soul. An excessively powerful curse can shatter a person's mental state, causing them to lose their sanity, if someone truly encounters such a situation." Professor Blaine paused. "I'm sorry, everyone. I haven't studied this issue in depth, so I can't provide a definitive solution." Professor Moody's magical eye swiveled in its socket, finally settling on Neville, who looked as if he were in mourning. In a gruff voice, he asked, "It's not entirely impossible to recover, is it, Professor Blaine?" "There might be a way, but the specifics need to be examined closely. You know, this kind of magical damage is quite unique," Professor Blaine replied tactfully. Despite his careful words, it was evident that he believed there was still hope for those whose spirits had been shattered by the Cruciatus Curse. Glancing at the clock on the wall, Professor Blaine quickened his pace. "Lastly, let's discuss Avada Kedavra. What are your thoughts?" "It attacks our souls, doesn't it?" Harry interjected, his face pale as he recalled the green light, the screaming woman, and the cruel smile that haunted his memories. Ignoring the curious glances from his classmates, Harry pressed on. "Avada Kedavra attacks the wizard's soul, so, if you're cursed, is there?" Harry struggled to find the right words to express his thoughts. "Is there anything you can do? You seem to have forgotten Professor Moody's teachings, Mr. Potter." Professor Blaine interjected, his eyelids fluttering slightly as the light in his lavender eyes flickered momentarily. "If you are struck by the Avada Kedavra curse, you will die instantly. There is no possibility of a cure. However, I must correct a misconception of yours, Mr. Potter. The Avada Kedavra does not attack the soul of a creature. Instead, it is a highly effective severing or peeling technique. What it targets is the intricate and unpredictable connection between the body and the soul. It severs this connection, stripping away your life, leading to death, Mr. Potter. End of this chapter.